You abandoned this family." My brother's voice slammed through the courtroom so hard that even the court reporter stopped typing for a second. "You disappeared for years while Mom and Dad suffered," Jason shouted, pointing directly at me. "And now you want half of everything Dad worked for?" The judge didn't answer right away. Instead, he opened a thick folder from the estate records and slowly adjusted his glasses. Then he looked at Jason and asked one quiet question. "Mr. Carter, who exactly sent your mother $12,000 every month for the last 8 years?" The room went completely silent. Jason's face lost color, and for the first time in my life, my older brother looked afraid. 3 weeks earlier, I stood outside my parents' church in Pensacola, Florida, staring at the white funeral program in my hands, while the Gulf wind pushed against my black dress. Harold Carter, beloved husband, father, and grandfather. My father had been dead for 4 days, and I still hadn't cried. Maybe because grief doesn't always arrive as tears. Sometimes it arrives as numbness. Sometimes it settles into your chest like wet concrete. The church parking lot overflowed with pickup trucks and old sedans from people who'd known my father for decades. He'd spent 42 years working at the naval shipyard before retiring with bad knees and a failing heart. Everybody respected Harold Carter. Quiet men usually earn that kind of respect slowly. I spotted my brother near the church entrance, shaking hands like a politician at a county fair. Jason wore a navy suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my grocery budget. His arm rested around our mother while he accepted sympathy from neighbors. He looked exhausted, but not grieving. There's a difference. When his eyes finally landed on me, his jaw tightened immediately. Mom turned too. The coldness in her expression hit harder than I expected. No smile. No hug. "No, I'm glad you made it home safely." Just silence. I should have been used to it by then. I'd spent most of my adult life learning how to stand in rooms where I wasn't fully wanted. I walked toward them slowly. "Hi, Mom." She gave a small nod without meeting my eyes. Jason let out a dry laugh. "Well," he said loudly, "look who finally remembered she had a family." A few nearby relatives awkwardly looked away. I ignored him. "I'm here for Dad," I said quietly. Jason smirked. "Funny timing." Mom finally spoke. "That's enough, Jason." But she didn't sound angry at him. She sounded tired. That hurt worse. Inside the church, I sat alone near the back pew, while old family friends shared stories about my father fixing fishing boats, helping neighbors after hurricanes, and volunteering at veteran breakfasts every Memorial Day. I listened quietly. Every story sounded true, but incomplete. Nobody talked about the man who quietly called me every Sunday night for 15 years. Nobody talked about the whispered conversations from overseas military bases while mortars echoed in the distance. Nobody talked about the nights Dad cried because he couldn't pay Mom's medical bills. Those stories belonged to me, and apparently they were going to stay buried with him. After the service, people gathered in the fellowship hall for sandwiches and coffee casseroles the church ladies always made after funerals. I stood near a window holding untouched coffee when my niece Ava approached me carefully. She was 20 now, college sophomore, sweet kid. "Hi, Aunt Emily," she said softly. I smiled for the first time all day. "You've grown up on me." She laughed a little. "You always say that." "That's because it keeps happening." For a second, things felt normal again. Then Jason appeared beside us. "Ava, your grandmother's looking for you." She hesitated before walking away. The second she disappeared, Jason's face hardened. "You've got some nerve showing up after all these years." I kept my voice calm. "I came to bury my father." "No," he snapped. "You came for the money." The accusation didn't surprise me. Still, hearing it out loud stung more than I expected. I didn't ask Dad for anything. Jason stepped closer. "You left this family behind while I stayed here cleaning up every mess." I almost laughed at the irony. But I stayed quiet. That always frustrated him more. He lowered his voice. "Mom's not gonna lose this house because of you." I stared at him carefully then. Lose the house. Dad had owned the house outright for years. Or at least, he was supposed to. Something cold moved through my stomach. "What are you talking about?" Jason looked away too fast. "Nothing." Then he walked off. That night I stayed in an old motel near Highway 98 because Mom never invited me home. The room smelled faintly like mildew and cigarette smoke baked into the curtains from 20 years earlier. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the blinking air conditioner while memories crawled through my head. Afghanistan. Kuwait. North Carolina? Long nights moving military cargo. Birthdays missed. Christmas calls from overseas. Wiring money home month after month. I closed my eyes. Dad's final voicemail still sat saved in my phone. I listened to it again around midnight. "Hey, Emmy, just checking in. Your mom's treatments went okay this week. Don't worry about us. I know you're tired. I'm proud of you anyway." His breathing sounded weak near the end. "I wish your brother understood someday." The message ended there. I didn't sleep much after that. 2 days later, the lawyer called us in for the will reading. The office sat in a brick building downtown beside a bait shop and an insurance agency. Small town Florida. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody's business. Jason arrived first with Mom and a leather folder tucked under his arm like he was already preparing for war. When the attorney explained that Dad's estate would be divided equally between both children, Jason exploded instantly. "What?" The lawyer calmly repeated himself. "Mr. Carter's will states that all remaining assets are to be divided 50-50 between Emily Carter and Jason Carter." Jason stood up so fast his chair nearly tipped backward. "This is insane." Mom looked shocked too. Jason pointed directly at me. "She abandoned this family for 20 years. The lawyer tried calming him down, but Jason kept going. "I stayed here, I took care of them, I handled everything while she played soldier overseas." I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. Still, I said nothing. Then Jason delivered the line that changed everything. "If she wants money so badly," he said bitterly, "we'll settle this in court." And deep down, I think that's exactly what my father knew would happen. I drove past my childhood home 3 times before finally pulling into the driveway. The little blue house looked smaller than I remembered. The porch railing leaned slightly now, and one of the shutters hung crooked beside the front window. Dad used to repaint every spring whether it needed it or not. The old oak tree was still there, though. Dad planted it the year I was born. I sat in my rental car for a full minute staring at the house while memories kept arriving uninvited. Summer thunderstorms. Mom frying catfish in the kitchen. Jason teaching me how to ride a bike before he became someone I barely recognized. Funny how grief mixes good memories with painful ones until you can't separate them anymore. I finally stepped out and walked toward the mailbox. The metal flag hung loose and rusted. Bills stuffed the box so tightly I could barely pull them free. Final notices, past due statements, medical collections, property tax warnings. My chest tightened immediately. Dad had never allowed unpaid bills to pile up like this. Never. I stood there flipping through envelopes while the Florida heat pressed down around me like wet wool. Then the front door opened. Mom stepped onto the porch slowly. For a second, she just stared at me. She looked older than she had at the funeral only 2 days earlier. Smaller somehow? Grief ages people fast. "You don't have to stand in the driveway," she said quietly. Not warm, not cold either. Just tired. I walked toward the porch. "How are you feeling?" "I buried my husband," she answered. "How do you think I'm feeling?" I nodded slowly. Fair enough. Inside the house smelled exactly the same. Coffee. Furniture polish. Dad's old pipe tobacco lingering in the walls even though Mom made him quit years ago. Some things never really leave a home. Mom moved carefully into the kitchen while I noticed stacks of unopened paperwork covering the dining table. More bills. More bank notices. I picked one up. Second mortgage statement. My stomach dropped. Dad took out a second mortgage. Why? The balance still owed was nearly $90,000. Mom noticed my expression immediately. "Your father said not to worry about it." "When did this happen?" She sat down heavily. "A few years ago." "A few years ago for what?" She looked away. "Jason had some business problems." "Of course he did." I closed my eyes for a second. Dad had mortgaged the house to save Jason again. How bad were the debts? Mom rubbed her forehead. "I don't know all the details." That meant she knew enough. I'd seen this pattern my entire life. Jason messed up. Dad rescued him. Mom defended him. And somehow everybody acted like it was normal. Meanwhile, I'd spent 20 years trying not to become another burden. Mom suddenly looked at me carefully. "Your brother stayed." I almost laughed. There it was. The family religion. Jason stayed. As if physical proximity automatically made someone loyal. "He lived 10 minutes away," I said quietly. Dad still climbed ladders fixing roofs in his 70s. "That's not fair." "No," I answered softly. "It isn't." The room went still after that. I didn't come home looking for a fight. But grief has a way of loosening old truths people spent years avoiding. Mom stood and opened the refrigerator. "You still take your coffee black?" "Yeah." She poured 2 cups automatically. For a few seconds it almost felt like old times again. Then she said the one thing I knew had lived in her heart for years. "You could have come home more." There it was. The accusation beneath every conversation since I enlisted. I wrapped both hands around the coffee mug before answering. The Marines sent me where they needed me. You always chose them. No, I said gently, I chose survival. Mom frowned. I rarely talked about our childhood openly. Dad worked constantly, but money was always thin. Jason burned through what little we had. And after he started gambling in his 20s, things got worse. There were months when Mom skipped medications to keep lights on. Months Dad secretly borrowed money from coworkers. I remembered the night I enlisted clearer than almost any memory in my life. Dad sat beside me on the back porch while cicadas screamed in the dark summer trees. You sure about this, Emmy? No, I admitted, but I can't stay here. Dad nodded slowly. I know. What if Mom hates me for leaving? He looked toward the kitchen window where Mom and Jason laughed over television reruns inside. Your mother loves hard, he said quietly. But sometimes she confuses love with holding on. I never forgot that sentence. Basic training changed me fast. The Marines have a way of stripping weakness out of you whether you're ready or not. I learned discipline, silence, distance. And I learned how to keep functioning while lonely. Especially lonely. The first time Dad asked for money, he sounded embarrassed. Only temporary, he promised over the phone. Jason had wrecked his truck drunk and lost another job. I wired $3,000 the next morning. Then came Mom's medications, then roof repairs after a hurricane, then overdue property taxes, then Jason's bankruptcy, then hospital bills after Dad's heart surgery. Eventually, the money transfers became routine, every month, without fail. Even after leaving active duty and moving into military logistics contracting, I kept sending money home. $12,000 monthly during the final years. Most of my salary disappeared before I ever touched it. But I kept living simply anyway. Small apartment, used truck, no vacations, no husband, no children, just work. And family obligations nobody acknowledged. Mom interrupted my thoughts suddenly. Jason says you're fighting him over the inheritance. I stared at her. I'm not fighting anyone. He says you want to force us to sell the house. The realization hit me immediately. Jason was poisoning her against me already. I would never throw you out of this house. Mom looked uncertain. That hurt more than anger would have. She truly didn't know what to believe anymore. A truck engine rumbled outside suddenly. Jason. Of course. He stormed into the kitchen carrying grocery bags dramatically like a man auditioning for sainthood. The second he saw me, his expression darkened. What are you doing here? Talking to Mom. Jason dumped groceries onto the counter. Well, Mom needs rest, not stress. I stood slowly. You mean she needs protection from the truth? His eyes narrowed instantly. What's that supposed to mean? I held up the mortgage statement. How much debt did you put Dad in? Mom immediately looked nervous. Jason stepped forward defensively. You don't know what you're talking about. Then explain $90,000. His face flushed red. That was Dad's decision. No, I said quietly, it was his sacrifice. Jason slammed his hand against the counter. You think sending checks makes you family? The words echoed through the kitchen. Mom looked stunned. And in that moment, I realized something terrible. Jason knew. Maybe not every detail, but he knew money had been coming from somewhere all these years, and he'd convinced himself he deserved it. That night after I left the house, I sat in my car outside the marina watching fishing boats rock against dark water. Dad used to bring me there after school sometimes, said the ocean made problems feel smaller. My phone buzzed around 9 o'clock. Unknown number. I answered carefully. Miss Carter? Yes. This is Daniel Reeves from the probate office. We may need additional financial records before next week's hearing. What kind of records? A pause. Your father attached several private account statements to the estate file. My grip tightened on the phone. What statements? Another pause. The judge specifically requested them remain sealed until court. The courthouse in Escambia County smelled like old paper floor polish and bad coffee. Somehow courthouses always smell the same no matter where you go. I arrived 20 minutes early wearing the only navy blazer I owned that still fit properly. My hands stayed steady, but my stomach hadn't settled since sunrise. I'd spent years working around military command centers, emergency logistics operations, and deployment briefings. None of that prepared me for sitting in a courtroom while your own family argued about your worth. Jason stood near the courtroom doors with his attorney when I walked in. He stopped talking immediately. His lawyer, a silver-haired man named Richard Coleman, looked polished and expensive. The kind of attorney who knew how to make ordinary people feel small without ever raising his voice. Jason folded his arms. You actually came. I looked at him evenly. You filed the case. His jaw tightened. You could still walk away from this peacefully. I almost smiled. Peacefully. Interesting word coming from him. Before I could answer, Mom entered slowly behind Jason. She looked nervous, more fragile than angry now. Her eyes met mine briefly, then dropped toward the floor. That hurt more than Jason's accusations ever could. The bailiff opened the courtroom doors a few minutes later. Carter Estate hearing. We entered quietly. Judge Walter Bennett already sat at the bench reviewing paperwork through reading glasses low on his nose. He looked about 70 himself. Calm face. Former military, if I had to guess from the posture alone. The courtroom wasn't crowded, but several relatives had shown up anyway. Small-town family drama attracts spectators like church gossip. I recognized 2 cousins and aunt from Mobile and 3 neighbors from my parents' street sitting quietly in the back rows. Jason wanted an audience. Of course he did. The hearing began formally enough. Estate summaries, property values, outstanding debts. Then Richard Coleman stood. Your Honor. He began smoothly. My client believes the existing will fails to reflect the reality of who actually cared for Harold and Diane Carter during their later years. I sat quietly. Coleman continued. Mr. Jason Carter remained physically present for both parents, while Miss Emily Carter voluntarily removed herself from the family for nearly 2 decades. There it was. Physically present. As if sitting nearby automatically counted as sacrifice, the attorney walked slowly before the judge. Mr. Carter handled medical appointments, household responsibilities, transportation needs, and emotional support, while his sister pursued a military career and later private contracting opportunities overseas. Jason lowered his head slightly at exactly the right moments. Performance, every bit of it. Then the attorney delivered the line designed to destroy me. Quite frankly, Your Honor, my client believes Miss Carter abandoned her responsibilities as a daughter. The word hung there. Abandoned. Like I'd deserted wounded people on a battlefield. Judge Bennett glanced toward me calmly. Miss Carter, would you like to respond? Every eye in the room shifted toward me. I could have explained everything right then. The deployments, the bills, the transfers, the years Dad quietly called asking for help. But something stopped me. Maybe exhaustion, maybe pride, or maybe I was simply too tired to beg people to see love that should have been obvious already. So I answered honestly. I served where I was assigned, Your Honor. Jason let out a bitter laugh. There she goes again. Always talking like a soldier instead of a daughter. The judge frowned slightly. Mr. Carter, control yourself. Jason shook his head emotionally. No, Your Honor. Somebody finally needs to say it. He turned toward the courtroom dramatically. My father died believing this family was broken because my sister chose strangers over us. Mom flinched beside him. That caught my attention. Jason noticed too late. Because suddenly I realized something important. Dad never would have said that. Not in a million years. Jason was rewriting our father now that the man couldn't defend himself. The attorney placed a hand lightly on Jason's arm. Take your time. Jason nodded like a grieving saint. I gave up opportunities to stay close to my parents, he continued. I sacrificed my own future to care for them. I stared at him in disbelief. Sacrificed. Jason had spent half his adult life unemployed. Dad paid his truck payments. Dad covered gambling debts. Dad refinanced the house twice because of him. And somehow Jason still saw himself as the martyr. The judge reviewed paperwork silently for several moments. Then he looked toward Mom. Mrs. Carter, would you like to make a statement? Mom hesitated. Her hands trembled slightly. Jason leaned closer to her immediately. You can tell the truth, Mom. Something about the way he said it bothered me deeply. Like coaching. Mom cleared her throat. Emily always worked hard, she said softly. Jason's expression changed instantly. But, she continued nervously, she wasn't around very much. There it was again. Around. The measurement everyone used against me. As though distance erased sacrifice, the judge nodded politely. Then he turned pages inside the estate file slowly. Very slowly. His expression changed almost immediately. He adjusted his glasses. Looked again. Then flipped backward several pages. The room grew quieter. Even Jason noticed something shifting. Judge Bennett leaned back slightly. Counselor, he said carefully, why are these financial records attached to the estate documents? Richard Coleman frowned. I'm sorry. The judge lifted several papers. These monthly wire transfers. My heartbeat slowed instantly. Dad had included them. Jason looked confused. What transfers? Judge Bennett studied the pages carefully. For approximately 8 years, he said slowly, Mrs. Diane Carter received monthly deposits averaging $12,000. The courtroom went still. Mom blinked in confusion. What? The judge continued reading. Consistent deposits, no interruptions. Jason frowned harder. That doesn't make sense. Judge Bennett looked directly at him then. Mr. Carter, do you know who sent your mother this money? Silence. Real silence, not courtroom silence. The kind that changes the oxygen in a room. Jason stared blankly. Mom looked frightened now. The judge turned another page. These funds appear connected to overseas military contracting accounts. My chest tightened. Dad really had prepared for this. Every transfer. Every statement. Every year. Saved. Protected. Jason slowly turned toward me. His face lost color one piece at a time. No, he whispered. I looked down at my hands. The judge spoke again. Miss Carter. I finally raised my eyes. Yes, Your Honor. Did these transfers come from you? Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I could hear the air conditioner humming above the courtroom ceiling. And suddenly, I was back in tiny overseas apartments eating microwave dinners alone while wiring money home before paying my own bills. Back in Kuwait working 18-hour days. Back in Afghanistan sleeping beside satellite phones waiting for Dad's late-night calls. Back in all those years nobody saw. I answered quietly. Yes, sir. Gasps spread softly through the courtroom. Mom's hand flew to her mouth. Jason stared at me like he'd never seen me before. The judge removed his glasses carefully. Then he asked the question that shattered my brother completely. If Miss Carter abandoned this family, he said slowly, who exactly has been keeping it alive? Nobody spoke for several seconds after the judge asked that question. Jason looked like a man trying to wake himself from a bad dream. Mom sat frozen beside him, both hands covering her mouth, while tears slowly gathered in her eyes. And me, I wished I were anywhere else. That's the part people never understand about family secrets. When the truth finally comes out, it rarely feels victorious. Mostly it feels sad. Judge Bennett laid the papers down carefully. Miss Carter, he said gently, please explain these transfers. I swallowed once before answering. There's not much to explain, Your Honor. The judge raised an eyebrow slightly. $12,000 monthly for nearly 8 years seems like quite a bit to explain. A few nervous chuckles moved through the courtroom before dying quickly. I kept my voice steady. My father called me after my mother got sick. They were behind on medical bills. Mom slowly turned toward me. Sick, she whispered. I looked at her carefully. You had cancer, Mom. Her face crumpled slightly. The judge glanced through more records. These transfers continued long after the treatments. Yes, sir. Why? I hesitated. Because the real answer sounded cruel out loud. Because one person in that family created emergencies faster than I could solve them. Finally, I answered honestly. Because the bills never stopped. Jason suddenly stood up. This is ridiculous. Judge Bennett looked up sharply. Sit down, Mr. Carter. Jason ignored him. She left us for 20 years, and now suddenly she's pretending to be some kind of hero. I closed my eyes briefly. Same Jason. Even cornered by evidence, he still reached for performance. The judge's tone hardened. No one said anything about heroes. Jason pointed at me furiously. She thinks sending money makes her better than everybody else. I looked at him quietly. I never said that. Then why hide it? The question landed harder than he realized. Because deep down, I'd asked myself that same thing for years. Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly. Yes, Miss Carter. Why was this arrangement secret? I looked toward Mom first. Then Jason. Then the old wooden floor between us. Because Dad asked me not to tell anyone. The courtroom stayed silent. The judge frowned thoughtfully. Did he explain why? I nodded slowly. He was ashamed. Jason laughed bitterly. Ashamed of what? This time I looked directly at him. Of how much debt you kept putting them in. The words hit the room like broken glass. Jason's face turned bright red instantly. That's a lie. No, I said quietly, it's not. Judge Bennett lifted another document from the estate file. What exactly were these debts connected to? I answered before Jason could. Failed businesses, credit cards, gambling loans, 2 bankruptcies, back taxes. Mom stared at Jason in disbelief. Jason. He turned toward her immediately. Don't listen to this. The judge interrupted calmly. The court has supporting records for those claims. Jason's breathing became shallow. I could see panic beginning to replace anger now. Because lies work best when nobody brings paperwork. Judge Bennett opened another sealed envelope from the estate file. This appears to be a handwritten statement from Harold Carter himself. The room went completely still again. Dad. Even after death, Dad was still trying to hold the family together. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading. If you are hearing this, he read slowly, Then my children have probably reached the point I feared most. Mom lowered her head immediately. The judge continued. My daughter Emily has supported this family financially for many years. Most of the money keeping this household alive came from her sacrifices. Jason stared at the table silently. Emily asked for nothing in return, the judge read. No praise, no control, no recognition. I felt heat building behind my eyes for the first time since Dad died. Judge Bennett turned another page. I asked her to keep the arrangement private because I wanted to protect this family from shame, especially Diane. Mom started crying softly. She loved Jason so fiercely that she could never fully see what was happening, and I was too weak to stop it. Jason suddenly slammed his palm against the table. This is unbelievable. The judge looked up sharply. Enough, Mr. Carter. Jason stood anyway. You're all acting like I robbed them. The judge's expression hardened. Didn't you? Jason froze. The silence that followed felt unbearable. Finally, he sat back down slowly. Judge Bennett returned to the letter. There's more. Nobody moved. If Jason ever reads this, the judge continued. I hope he understands something before it's too late. Love is not measured by who stays physically closest. Sometimes the child carrying the heaviest burden is the one suffering quietly far away. Mom broke completely then. The sound that came out of her didn't even sound like crying anymore. It sounded like regret. Deep, crushing regret. I stared at the table because I couldn't bear looking at her. The judge folded the letter carefully. Then he asked softly, Mrs. Carter, were you aware your daughter was paying most household expenses? Mom shook her head slowly through tears. Number. Were you aware Miss Carter funded your cancer treatments? Another shake. No. I closed my eyes briefly. Dad really never told her. Not fully. Maybe he thought protecting everyone would somehow keep the family from falling apart. But hidden truths rot families from the inside eventually. Judge Bennett reviewed more records. There are also tuition payments made to Florida State University under an anonymous trust. Ava, my niece. Jason looked confused again. The judge glanced up. These payments also came from Miss Carter. Mom turned toward me slowly like she no longer recognized her own daughter. You paid for Ava's college. I nodded once. She deserved a chance. Mom covered her face again. Oh my God. Jason looked shattered now. Not remorseful yet. Just exposed. There's a difference. The judge leaned back quietly. Then he looked directly at me. One thing still confuses me, Miss Carter. I waited. You could have defended yourself years ago. Why stay silent? That question settled over the courtroom heavier than all the financial records combined. Even Jason looked at me then, waiting. I thought about every lonely deployment, every missed holiday, every time Mom praised Jason for being there while Dad quietly thanked me over the phone for keeping electricity on. Then I answered honestly, because I didn't want my mother to hate her son. Nobody moved after that, not even Jason. And for the first time since this whole nightmare began, my brother finally looked ashamed. The hearing recessed for lunch, but nobody moved right away. The courtroom sat under a heavy silence that seemed to press against every wall. Jason remained frozen in his chair, staring at the table while Mom quietly cried beside him. I stood slowly gathering my folder and purse, hoping to leave before anybody tried speaking to me. Then I heard Mom's voice behind me. Emily. I stopped. Not because I wanted to. Because after all these years, some part of me still reacted any time my mother sounded broken. I turned carefully. She looked smaller than ever, sitting there alone in the courtroom bench. Her mascara had streaked slightly beneath tired eyes, and grief seemed to pull at her shoulders like physical weight. I didn't know she whispered. The words trembled so badly they almost disappeared. I nodded once. I know. That only made her cry harder. I couldn't stay there watching it. So I left the courtroom and walked outside into the humid Florida afternoon. The heat hit me instantly. Thunderclouds gathered low over Pensacola Bay while traffic rolled slowly past the courthouse square. I sat alone on a bench beneath an old magnolia tree and stared at nothing for a while. Funny thing about emotional exhaustion. Eventually you stop feeling angry. You just feel empty. About 20 minutes later, somebody sat down beside me. Jason. I almost stood immediately. Relax, he muttered. I'm not here to fight. I kept my eyes forward. That'd be a nice change. He gave a bitter half-laugh. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he rubbed both hands over his face and said quietly, You really paid for all that. There was no point lying anymore. Yes. Why? I looked at him carefully. What do you mean, why? You hated us. That one genuinely stunned me. I turned fully toward him for the first time all day. Hated you. He shrugged helplessly. You left. There it was again. That childish equation he'd built his whole life around. Leaving equals betrayal. Staying equals love. No matter what actually happened afterward. I leaned back against the bench slowly. You know what I remember most from leaving for basic training? He frowned slightly. What? Dad slipping $50 into my bag because he knew I didn't have enough money for toiletries. Jason looked away. I remember Mom crying like somebody died, I continued. And I remember you asking Dad if you could have my car. His face tightened immediately. That was 20 years ago. Yes, I said softly. And somehow nothing ever changed after that. The breeze picked up around us, carrying the smell of rain and salt water. Jason stared out toward the street. You think I'm some kind of monster? I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was more complicated than that. No, I finally said. I think you got used to being rescued. That hit him harder than yelling would've. He lowered his eyes toward the sidewalk. I didn't ask Dad to mortgage the house. No, I replied quietly. You just kept creating situations where he felt he had to. Jason swallowed hard. For the first time since I came home, he actually looked tired instead of angry. You don't understand what it was like staying here? I almost laughed at the irony again. You're right, I said. I was too busy sleeping in military tents. His jaw clenched. That's not fair. Neither was wiring half my paycheck home while hearing people call me selfish. That one landed. Hard. Jason looked down at his hands. You know what Dad used to say about you? I waited. He said you were the strongest person he'd ever known. Something inside my chest tightened painfully. Dad rarely gave compliments directly. That generation of men didn't always know how. Jason shook his head slowly. I hated hearing it. I looked at him carefully. Why? Because every time he said your name, Jason whispered, I felt like I was already disappointing him. That changed something. Not everything, but something. For the first time, I stopped seeing only the selfish adult sitting beside me. I saw the scared little boy our parents accidentally trapped inside him. Dad expected strength from me. Mom protected weakness in Jason. And over decades, those roles hardened into identities none of us escaped. Jason laughed bitterly to himself. You know the worst part? What? I actually convinced myself you owed us that money. I stared at him. He shook his head in shame. You left, so I figured, I don't know, maybe taking care of Mom and Dad was your responsibility financially. The honesty sounded ugly. But honest ugliness is still better than lies. Rain finally began falling lightly through the magnolia branches overhead. Jason looked exhausted. I really thought you abandoned us. I answered quietly. No, you just needed me invisible. That sentence stayed between us for a long time. Eventually, Jason stood slowly. I don't know how to fix this. I looked toward the courthouse windows. You probably can't. He nodded sadly like he already knew that. Then he walked away through the rain. That evening I returned to the motel expecting another lonely night and bad television. Instead, I found Mom sitting outside my room in one of the plastic chairs near the ice machine. Seeing her there nearly stopped my heart. She stood slowly when she saw me. I hope this isn't inappropriate. I unlocked the room quietly. Come inside. The motel air conditioner rattled loudly while Mom sat carefully at the small table by the window. She looked around the room once. You've been staying here this whole time? Yes. Guilt crossed her face immediately. I sat across from her. Neither of us knew how to begin. Finally, Mom reached into her purse and pulled out a bundle of old envelopes tied with string. I found these in your father's dresser. I recognized my handwriting instantly. Letters. Dozens of them. Letters I mailed home from overseas bases over the years. Mom's hands trembled while touching them. I never read most of these, she admitted quietly. Your father said you were busy and didn't want to bother me with military things. I swallowed hard. Dad protected everyone until the very end. Mom opened one carefully. I spent Christmas eating vending machine cookies in Kuwait tonight. She read softly, tears already forming again. But at least the money should arrive before the mortgage payment is due. Her voice cracked completely. She opened another. I know Jason's struggling again. Please don't make him feel ashamed. Just tell Dad I'll send extra next month. Another. I'm sorry I missed your birthday, Mom. I promise I'll make it home next year. She stopped reading then because she couldn't continue. The room filled with quiet crying. Not dramatic, not loud. Just years of misunderstanding finally collapsing under truth. Mom looked at me through tears. You were lonely all this time? I nodded once. Yes. She covered her mouth and whispered the words I'd waited 20 years to hear. You never abandoned us. The final hearing took place 3 days later under gray skies and steady Florida rain. By then, word had spread through half of Pensacola. Small towns survive on fishing church suppers and other people's family tragedies. When I walked into the courthouse that morning, conversations quietly stopped around me. Not hostile this time. Awkward. Respectful, maybe. I still wasn't sure how to feel about that. Jason stood alone near the courtroom doors when I arrived. No dramatic performance, no loud speeches, no expensive lawyer trying to shape the room. Just my brother looking older than he had a week earlier. He nodded once when he saw me. I nodded back. That was enough. Inside the courtroom, Judge Bennett reviewed the final estate documents while rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Mom sat between us this time instead of beside Jason. A small detail. But emotionally, it meant everything. The judge cleared his throat. After reviewing all financial records, testimony, and supporting documents, this court finds no basis to challenge Harold Carter's original will. Jason lowered his eyes immediately. The estate, the judge continued, will remain divided equally between both children. Nobody reacted. No celebration. No victory. Because by then, this had stopped feeling like a fight over money. Judge Bennett folded his hands together. However, he added carefully, I would like the record to reflect something beyond legal findings. The courtroom quieted further. I have presided over probate and family cases for over 30 years, he said. Most involve anger over property. Very few involve sacrifice of this magnitude. I stared down at the table silently. The judge looked toward Jason. Your sister spent years carrying responsibilities that should never have belonged to one person alone. Jason nodded faintly without arguing. Then the judge looked toward me. And Miss Carter, silence may protect a family temporarily, but hidden sacrifice eventually becomes another form of suffering. That one stayed with me. Because he was right. Keeping quiet hadn't saved us. It only delayed the collapse. The hearing officially ended a few minutes later. People slowly began standing and gathering papers while quiet conversations filled the room. Then something unexpected happened. Jason stood. Not dramatically. Not loudly. He simply faced the courtroom and cleared his throat. I need to say something. The room settled again. Jason looked nervous for the first time in his life. My sister didn't abandon this family, he said quietly. I just spent too many years blaming her because it was easier than blaming myself. Mom immediately started crying again. Jason continued slowly. I kept telling myself staying nearby made me the better son. But the truth is... He swallowed hard. I stayed because everybody kept rescuing me. Nobody moved. I loved my father, he whispered, but I also used him. Those words cost him something. You could hear it. Real accountability always hurts. Jason turned toward me fully then. I don't expect forgiveness, he said, but I am sorry. For a second, 20 years of anger pressed against my chest all at once. Missed birthdays. Overseas holidays. Phone calls asking for more money. Being treated like a stranger in my own family. Part of me wanted to stay angry forever. Honestly, it would have been easier. But Dad didn't spend his entire life trying to hold us together just so we could destroy each other after he died. So I answered honestly, I'm still angry. Jason nodded slowly. I know, but... I continued quietly, I'm tired of losing family. That nearly broke Mom completely. She reached for both our hands at once like she was afraid we might disappear again if she let go. Outside the courthouse, rain still poured steadily over the parking lot while people rushed beneath umbrellas. Jason lingered beside my truck awkwardly. There's something else, I said. He looked up cautiously. I spoke with the estate attorney yesterday. His expression tightened immediately. I'm not taking the full inheritance. Jason frowned in confusion. What? I leaned against the truck door. Dad wanted Ava protected more than anything. Jason blinked several times. I'm placing part of my share into an education and housing trust for her. He stared at me speechless. You'd still do that, after everything. I looked toward the rain. Ava didn't cause any of this. Jason covered his eyes briefly with one hand. When he lowered it again, tears mixed with rain on his face. My older brother had probably spent half his life avoiding shame. Now it finally sat in front of him with nowhere left to run. I don't deserve that kind of kindness, he whispered. No, I said gently. Probably not. He almost laughed through the tears. But Dad would have wanted it anyway. That finished him. Jason broke down completely right there beside the courthouse parking lot. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a tired, middle-aged man finally collapsing under years of denial. And for the first time since we were children, I put my arm around my brother. Man, 6 months later, we stood together beside Dad's grave on a quiet Sunday morning. The oak trees around the cemetery swayed gently in warm Gulf Coast wind, while distant church bells echoed across town. Mom placed fresh flowers carefully beside the headstone. She looked healthier now, lighter somehow, not because grief disappeared, but because truth finally had room to breathe inside our family. Jason had started attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings 3 months earlier. He found steady work managing inventory at a marine supply warehouse. Nothing glamorous, but honest. Ava was preparing for graduate school. And me, for the first time in 20 years, I'd stopped taking overseas contracts. I rented a small house 15 minutes from Mom's place. Close enough to help, far enough to breathe. As we prepared to leave the cemetery, Mom reached for my hand. "Your father would be proud of you." I smiled softly. "He loved you too, Mom." Fresh tears filled her eyes immediately. "I know," she whispered. We ate dinner together afterward at a little seafood restaurant near the marina. Nothing fancy. Fried shrimp, hush puppies, bad coffee. But somewhere between passing tartar sauce and arguing about football scores, we started sounding like a family again. Not perfect, not healed completely, but trying. And at our age, sometimes trying is the bravest thing left. If this story touched your heart, remember to cherish the quiet people in your life, the ones who carry burdens without asking for praise. Sometimes the strongest love is the kind nobody sees until much later. And if you've ever known someone who sacrificed silently for family, share this story with them. They deserve to be remembered too. The first thing my father saw was the soup running down my face. Not the man who had poured it over my head. Not the stunned silence that had swallowed the dining room. Not the way every fork had frozen halfway to every mouth in that polished Charleston restaurant. What he saw was me, 52 years old, standing there in a cream-colored blouse now stained with tomato bisque, drawing attention to the Reeves family table. And the first words out of his mouth were, "Abigail, sit down, you're embarrassing us." Even now, thinking back on that moment, I can still hear the soft clink of silverware, the low jazz humming from hidden speakers, the smell of fresh bread and basil hanging in the air. And I remember thinking something I never expected to think about my own father. He would rather see me humiliated than inconvenience a stranger. The man standing over me was named Derek Mercer. At the time, I knew him only as one of my younger brother Caleb's business associates, the sort of man Charleston produced in steady supply these days. Expensive loafers, bright white teeth, hair too carefully messy to be accidental. The kind of man who mistook confidence for character. He was smiling when he dumped the soup over my head. "Look at her," he'd announced loudly enough for half the room to hear, too scared to fight back. A few people laughed. Not because it was funny. Because weak people often laugh when cruelty enters the room. They think it protects them from becoming the next target. I slowly reached for my napkin and dabbed at my face. Across the table, my younger brother Caleb smirked into his bourbon glass. Mother looked horrified, but not for me. For the scene. And Father? Father wouldn't even meet my eyes. I looked at him anyway. After all these years, some part of me still expected him to become the man I had needed when I was 16, or 22, or 35. A man who might say, "That's my daughter, show some respect." Instead, he leaned slightly toward me and whispered through clenched teeth, "Be quiet, don't make this worse." Something inside me became very still. Not broken. Not angry. Just still. The kind of stillness I'd learned years ago in places far more dangerous than this restaurant. The kind that comes just before action. I reached up, lifted the soup bowl from where Derek had dropped it crookedly against my shoulder, and placed it carefully on the table. Then I stood. Derek straightened a little surprised. He'd expected tears, maybe shouting, maybe some dramatic reaction he could mock later over drinks. Instead, I looked him directly in the eye and knocked the bowl onto the hardwood floor. It shattered. The crack echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Then I said very calmly, "You've made a serious mistake." His smile faltered. Only for a second. Then he laughed again. "Oh yeah, you gonna call your lawyer?" I held his gaze for another moment. "No," I said. Then I turned and walked out. No shouting. No threats. No explanations. Just silence. That unsettled him more than any outburst could have. I knew because I heard him call after me as I crossed the dining room. Yeah, that's right, walk away. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Outside Charleston's evening air was warm and smelled faintly of salt drifting in from the harbor. I stood beneath the restaurant awning and let the humid breeze dry the soup on my skin. For a long moment I simply breathed. People often imagine restraint as weakness. They imagine that if you do not strike back immediately, you are afraid. They have no understanding of what real discipline costs. At 52, I had spent more than half my life mastering that discipline. 28 years in naval service had taught me many things. How to endure pain without complaint. How to assess threats quickly. How to keep my voice steady when chaos pressed in from every side. How to wait. Waiting properly done is one of the most powerful acts a person can perform. A black sedan idled across the street. The driver stepped out the moment he saw me. "Commander Reeves?" "Evening, Harris." His eyes flicked to the soup staining my blouse. His jaw tightened. What happened? Nothing requiring intervention. He knew better than to press. He opened the rear door and I slid inside. As Charleston's old brick buildings drifted past the window, I thought about my father. About all the years he'd spent disappointed that his eldest child had not become what he considered respectable. He'd wanted country clubs, law school, marriage to some polished Charleston attorney. Not military service. Certainly not naval special warfare. The truth was neither he nor mother had ever understood what I actually did. Security clearances made detailed explanations impossible. So they had built their own assumptions. To them, I was still the difficult daughter who had run away to join the Navy. And Caleb, charming local visible Caleb, was success incarnate. I had long ago stopped trying to correct them. But tonight felt different. Because this time their silence had not merely disappointed me. It had revealed them. As the sedan turned toward the harbor district, my secure phone vibrated. One message. From Admiral Thomas Whitaker. "Saw the incident. Call me immediately." I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge. Because Derek Mercer had no idea what kind of attention he had just attracted. And in exactly 1 week he was going to learn who Abigail Reeves really was. By the time I returned Admiral Whitaker's call, the city lights of Charleston had become scattered gold across the harbor water. Harris drove in silence as he always did, his attention fixed on the road. He had worked with me for nearly 4 years and understood that quiet was often more useful than conversation. The phone rang only once before Whitaker answered. "Abigail." His voice carried that same steady authority I had first heard 23 years earlier, when he was Captain Whitaker, and I was a young lieutenant trying very hard not to look terrified during my first operational briefing. "Sir, I take it you're all right." "I'm fine." A pause. Then his tone sharpened. What happened tonight was unacceptable. I glanced through the tinted window at the familiar Charleston streets. Nothing had changed here. The old oak trees still draped their branches over the roads. The gas lanterns still glowed outside historic homes. The same families still traded the same polite smiles over the same old judgments. And somehow, all these years later, I still became 17 again whenever my father looked disappointed. "It was a drunken fool trying to impress a room full of strangers," I said. "That fool assaulted a senior naval special warfare commander in public." His words were matter of fact. Not emotional. Not angry. Simply true. "I assume there's footage. The restaurant has already preserved security video." Of course they had. Charleston might be old-fashioned in manners, but every establishment worth its reputation had modern surveillance. "I'm not interested in making this bigger than necessary." Whitaker gave a quiet breath that might have been amusement. "That decision may no longer be yours." I knew what he meant. Once certain lines were crossed, procedure took over. A public assault against someone in my position created complications far beyond personal insult. Security concerns, federal review, questions about motive access and vulnerability. The kind of things Washington took seriously whether I wanted it or not. Still, I said only understood. After we ended the call, I leaned back and closed my eyes. And as often happens when the present becomes too heavy, memory pulled me backward. I was 18 again, standing in my parents' kitchen in our old brick house on Trad Street. My acceptance papers from Annapolis sat folded in my hands. Mother was crying softly at the sink. Father stood by the window staring out at the garden. "You'll throw your life away," he said. Not loudly. That was never his way. Disappointment delivered softly can cut deeper than rage. "I've made my decision." He turned, then his expression calm and distant. "The Navy is for people who have no better options." That sentence stayed with me for years, not because it hurt, because it clarified everything. I understood in that moment that if I stayed in Charleston and built the life my father approved of, I would never know whether I had been capable of more. So I left. And I never looked back. Annapolis nearly broke me. The first year was a blur of exhaustion and failure, and learning that discipline matters more than talent. The men underestimated me immediately. A Southern girl with careful manners and good posture did not fit their assumptions of toughness. I let them underestimate me. That became a habit. Then BUD/S nearly killed me. People love talking about Navy SEAL training as though it's some kind of action movie spectacle. Mostly it's cold. Relentless, bone-deep cold. And fatigue so profound your mind starts inventing reasons to quit. The instructors never needed to scream much. Your own thoughts did that work for them. I survived because I discovered something simple. Pain always ends. But regret has no expiration date. When Hell Week was over, I weighed 11 pounds less and looked 10 years older. And for the first time in my life, I felt fully myself. Years passed. Assignments accumulated. Leadership came gradually. Then suddenly, Afghanistan. The Horn of Africa. Joint operations too classified to discuss even now. Promotions. Responsibility. Losses I still carry. Eventually command. Eventually Washington. Eventually the kind of clearance that meant even my own family could know almost nothing about what I actually did. So when Mother asked what I was working on, I would say administrative operations. When Father asked if I was ever planning to settle down and do something stable, I would smile and say, I'm exactly where I should be. He always took that as evasion. Perhaps it was. But some truths are too large for ordinary conversation. And some people are unwilling to hear them anyway. The car slowed as we entered the private drive to the harbor residence the Navy maintained for my Charleston visits. As Harris opened my door, he hesitated. "Ma'am, permission to speak freely." I stepped out. "Granted." He looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for him. I reviewed local records after we left the restaurant. That got my attention. And that man, Derek Mercer. He's tied to an active financial inquiry involving Charleston redevelopment contracts. I studied him. How active? Preliminary federal review, fraud indicators. Interesting. Very interesting. Connected to Caleb. His expression told me enough before he answered. "Yes, ma'am." For a moment I said nothing. Then I looked toward the dark harbor and felt something cold settle into place. Not revenge. Not satisfaction. Recognition. The world often reveals character long before consequences arrive. Consequences simply make everyone else notice. I thanked Harris and went inside. An hour later, standing alone in the guest suite overlooking Charleston Harbor, I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Mother. 1 from Caleb. None from Father. I deleted them all unread. Then another message appeared. From an unknown number. "You should have stayed quiet tonight. Some people don't like being embarrassed." No signature. No need for one. I smiled faintly. Derek had made his second mistake. And this one would be much harder to survive than the first. I slept well that night. That may sound strange considering the circumstances. A man had publicly humiliated me, threatened me afterward, and very likely tied himself to a growing federal investigation involving my own brother. Most people would have lain awake replaying every detail. But years in naval special warfare teach you something civilians often misunderstand. You sleep when sleep is available. Worry is not preparation. It is simply wasted energy. By 6 the next morning I was awake and standing barefoot on the harbor residence balcony watching Charleston come alive. Fishing boats moved slowly across the water. A church bell rang somewhere downtown. The air smelled of salt and magnolia blossoms. It was beautiful in the quiet way Charleston has always been, beautiful, polished, and dignified on the surface, full of old tensions underneath. Much like my family. I had just finished my second cup of coffee when my secure phone rang. Admiral Whitaker. Good morning, sir. You've made quite an impression back home. I could hear the dry humor in his voice. What's happened? The footage circulated faster than expected. That surprised me. Whitaker rarely sounded surprised himself, which made the statement significant. Public. Not yet, internal. That meant someone had shared it through official channels. The implications were immediate. Federal review was no longer theoretical. What's the status? The Department of Defense referred the incident to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service at 0600. DHS has also flagged Derek Mercer due to overlap with an ongoing financial corruption inquiry. I leaned against the balcony rail and stared out at the harbor. The machinery had begun moving. And once federal machinery starts, it develops a rhythm of its own. Slow at first, then unstoppable. Does Mercer know? Not yet. He paused. Then, your brother may. That was interesting. How? His firm's records were subpoenaed 2 weeks ago under sealed review. I closed my eyes briefly. Caleb. Always clever enough to succeed quickly. Never wise enough to think beyond the next win. Our father loved that kind of ambition. He used to say Caleb had killer instinct, as though decency were some kind of professional handicap. Anything further required from me? No, continue as scheduled. That meant exactly what it sounded like. Remain visible. Attend the Veterans Legacy Gala in 1 week as planned. Maintain routine. Let events unfold. I understood. And because I understood, I asked no further questions. After the call ended, I dressed simply white blouse, navy slacks, low heels, and drove myself downtown. Sometimes before difficult things, I like to move through ordinary life. It reminds me what all the larger battles are supposedly protecting. Charleston was busy that morning. Tourists wandered Market Street carrying iced coffees and maps. Shopkeepers swept sidewalks. Old men argued cheerfully outside the corner cigar shop about college football predictions, as though national stability depended on them. America in all its ordinary grace. I stopped at a small bookstore I'd loved since childhood. The owner, Mrs. Talbot, looked up from behind the register and blinked. Abigail Reeves. Her smile spread instantly. Well, I'll be. I smiled back. She must have been nearly 80 now, though she carried herself with the same brisk energy I remembered from childhood visits. Good morning, Mrs. Talbot. She stepped around the counter and hugged me warmly. You're home. For a few days? She pulled back and studied my face carefully. Then her expression shifted. Something's wrong. Older people often notice what younger ones miss. Life sharpens that skill. It's manageable. She gave me the look only Southern women of a certain generation can produce, the one that communicates both affection and command. Sit. So I sat. And for the next 20 minutes she poured tea and reminded me of things I had forgotten. Like the summer I spent reading every naval history book in her shop because Father had grounded me after I announced my plans for Annapolis. Like how she had quietly slipped biographies of Admiral Grace Hopper and Rear Admiral Michelle Howard into my stack because she thought I needed examples, like how she had told me at 17. The world will always be threatened by a competent woman who does not require permission. I laughed softly, remembering it. Then she reached across the little cafe table and squeezed my hand. Your father still doesn't understand what he raised, does he? Number. Well, she said, her eyes brightening with familiar steel, he's overdue. By noon, my phone was vibrating constantly. Mother had called 6 times. Caleb twice. 1 voicemail from Father. I listened to his message while sitting in my car beneath a live oak dripping Spanish moss. His voice sounded controlled. Too controlled. Abigail. There appears to be some misunderstanding involving Caleb's firm and federal auditors. Caleb believes this may somehow connect to your incident last night. Call me immediately. Not concern for me. Concern for Caleb. Even now. I deleted the voicemail. Then another call came. This time from NCIS Special Agent Marcus Bell. I answered. Commander Reeves. Ma'am, I'm required to inform you that Mr. Mercer contacted several local associates this morning, attempting to obtain your classified service record. I went still. That changed things. Was he successful? No, ma'am. Good. Bell hesitated. Then, he also told one contact he planned to confront you publicly at the Veterans Legacy Gala. I smiled. Not because the threat amused me. Because Derek Mercer was still making mistakes, and he had no idea how expensive each one was becoming. Thank you, Agent Bell. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I looked toward Charleston Harbor again and thought, some storms announce themselves with thunder. Others arrive beneath clear skies. Derek Mercer still believed he was hunting prey. In exactly 6 days he would learn he had stepped into a battlefield he could not even see. And by then it would already be too late. The Veterans Legacy Gala had been a Charleston institution for nearly 40 years. My father used to donate every year. Not because he cared particularly deeply about veterans, but because attendance placed the Reeves name exactly where Charleston society believed it belonged, near polished silver expensive bourbon and people who measured human worth by lineage and seating arrangements. As a child, I had attended several of those dinners. I remembered chandeliers throwing warm light across white tablecloths, elderly men telling stories about Korea and Vietnam, women in elegant dresses speaking softly about duty and sacrifice. Back then, I thought patriotism looked like pressed tuxedos and crystal glasses. Later, I learned it usually looked like exhaustion grit and people quietly carrying burdens no one else would ever fully understand. That Saturday evening, I arrived through the side entrance reserved for official guests. I wore full navy dress whites, not because I wanted to impress anyone, because protocol required it. The uniform fit as naturally as my own skin after so many years. The gold shoulder boards, ribbons, and command insignia carried weight but not vanity. Each one represented responsibility. Each one remembered people who had paid more for service than I ever had. As I adjusted my cuffs in the preparation room, Admiral Whitaker entered. At 73, he still moved like a man accustomed to command. His silver hair was immaculate, his bearing straight enough to embarrass officers half his age. He looked me over and gave a small nod. Still impossible to intimidate, I see. I smiled. Years of practice, sir. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. NCIS made their arrests this afternoon. That stopped me. Arrests. 3 executives tied to Mercer Development, fraud, embezzlement, procurement violations. I processed that quickly. And Derek? Not yet. Whitaker's expression hardened. He insisted on attending tonight despite legal counsel advising otherwise. Of course he had. Men like Derek often confuse denial with strategy. He likely believed his usual charm would smooth everything over. He had no idea federal investigators were already seated inside. Caleb. Not charged. Yet. That single word hung between us unspoken. Whitaker studied me carefully. You understand what happens tonight changes your family permanently. I know. Any regrets? I thought of father looking away as soup ran down my face. Of mother's anxious silence. Of Caleb's smirk. And strangely, I felt no anger. Only sadness for all the years we might have spent differently. No regrets, I said. Whitaker nodded once. Then let's proceed. The ballroom was already full when we entered. Charleston's best and oldest money glittered beneath the chandeliers. Soft conversation filled the room. A string quartet played near the stage. And then I saw my family. Mother sat stiffly at table 12, her pearl necklace catching the light. Father wore his usual black tuxedo posture, immaculate expression, composed. Caleb leaned back comfortably, drink in hand, talking to Derek Mercer. Derek looked very pleased with himself. He was laughing. Then the announcer's voice filled the room. Ladies and gentlemen, please rise to welcome this year's Distinguished National Service honoree. The room quieted. I stepped forward beside Admiral Whitaker. The announcer continued. Recipient of the Silver Star Bronze Star with Valor and Current Strategic Operations, Commander for Naval Special Warfare. A murmur spread instantly. People began standing. Then came the final words. Commander Abigail Reeves. The room erupted into applause. Not polite applause. Real applause. The kind born of genuine respect. Every eye turned toward me. And across that vast ballroom I saw my father's face lose all color. Mother's hand flew to her mouth. Caleb's drink froze halfway to his lips. And Derek looked as though someone had driven ice through his spine. His mouth actually fell open. I walked calmly toward the stage as senior officers rose and saluted. I returned each salute. No triumph. No performance. Simply acknowledgement. When I reached the podium, the applause slowly faded. I delivered the prepared remarks. Briefly, about service, about sacrifice, about the quiet strength of military families, about the debt we owe to those who carried impossible burdens without complaint. Then I stepped back. The audience rose again, and this time I saw my father standing too. Not because etiquette demanded it, because his knees had nearly given way. After the ceremony, the room buzzed with astonishment. People approached from every direction. Old Charleston families who had barely acknowledged me for years now spoke with admiration. Retired officers offered handshakes. Younger service members introduced themselves with obvious pride. And through all of it, Derek stood frozen beside Caleb's table, waiting. Finally, I walked toward them. Father rose first. His mouth opened, but no words came. Mother looked close to tears. Caleb's confidence had vanished entirely. And Derek was pale, sweating visibly. When I stopped before him, he swallowed hard. "Commander, I didn't know." His voice shook. I looked at him steadily. "No," I said, "you didn't." He tried again. I'd like to apologize." For a long moment, no one spoke. The ballroom noise seemed to recede. Then I said calmly enough for all four of them to hear. "Mr. Mercer, when you poured soup over my head, your mistake was not failing to recognize my rank." His face twitched. "Your mistake was believing someone's worth depends on whether they can benefit you." The words landed harder than anger ever could have. His shoulders sagged. Behind him, federal agents had entered the room. And when Derek finally saw them approaching, he understood. The lesson had arrived. And there would be no walking away this time. The first thing Derek Mercer did when he saw the federal agents was glance at Caleb. It was a small movement, quick enough that most people in the ballroom would never have noticed. But years of command teach you to notice what men do in moments when instinct outruns performance. And in that brief, involuntary turn of his head, Derek revealed exactly where his fear was pointing. Toward my brother. Special Agent Marcus Bell approached with the calm, measured confidence federal investigators tend to develop after years of dealing with men who believe panic can somehow reverse facts. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, neat dark suit, no wasted motion. He gave me a polite nod first. "Commander Reeves." "Agent Bell." Then he turned to Derek. "Mr. Mercer, we need to speak with you regarding an ongoing federal investigation into procurement fraud, securities, misrepresentation, and conspiracy to obstruct financial review." Derek stared at him blankly for half a second. The human mind often grants itself one final instant of disbelief before reality settles in. Then his face collapsed. "This is a mistake." Bell's expression remained neutral. "It would be best if you cooperated." Around us, Charleston society had gone still. No one openly stared. Old Southern manners forbid obvious spectacle, but every eye was watching. Quietly, hungrily. The room had sensed blood. Derek's gaze darted again to Caleb. And this time my brother failed to hide his fear. His glass trembled visibly in his hand. Bell noticed. "Of course he did." "Mr. Reeves," he said evenly, "you'll likely be contacted shortly regarding related documentation requests." Caleb forced a smile. "I'm sure there's some misunderstanding." Bell's face did not change. "There often is." He placed a hand lightly on Derek's shoulder. "Come with us." Derek resisted for exactly 1 second. Then survival instinct overtook pride. As the agents escorted him across the ballroom, conversation slowly resumed in cautious murmurs. But no one returned to normal. The air had changed. Truth does that to a room. It alters the pressure. When the doors closed behind Derek and the agents, my mother exhaled sharply as though she had been holding her breath for hours. Father remained standing, staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not disappointment. Not judgment. Recognition. As though he were seeing his daughter for the first time. Caleb recovered first. He always had quick instincts when self-preservation was involved. He stepped toward me, lowering his voice. "Abigail, we need to talk privately." I regarded him for a moment, then nodded. We moved to a smaller side terrace overlooking the harbor. Charleston's humid night wrapped around us, warm and heavy. Inside, muted music drifted through the glass doors. For several seconds, Caleb said nothing. He was recalculating. That was his gift. And his curse. Finally, he turned to me, all polished concern. "You could help fix this." I almost smiled. There it was. Not apology. Not accountability. Strategy. How? "You clearly have influence here, connections. If this investigation escalated because of what happened at dinner..." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Surely you could clarify things. Explain Derek was drunk, that no offense was intended." I studied my younger brother. At 48, Caleb had our father's careful features softened by easier living. He had always been handsome in the way Charleston rewarded clean-cut, practiced ease, expensive confidence. People trusted him quickly. He had spent his life learning how to turn that trust into opportunity. And standing there beneath the terrace lights, asking me to save him from consequences he likely deserved, he looked suddenly very young. Almost frightened. "Did you know?" I asked. His eyes flickered. There it was again. The smallest betrayal. "Yes," he said quietly. "At first it seemed minor. Accounting shortcuts. Everyone does it. Then it got bigger." The honesty surprised me. Fear had finally stripped him down to something real. "Why continue?" He gave a humorless laugh. "You know, Father." "Yes." I did. Success had always been the family religion. And Caleb had been its chosen disciple. He needed to win, Caleb said, and eventually so did I. For the first time that evening, I felt true sorrow. Not for what Caleb had done. For how long he had mistaken approval for love. He looked at me desperately. "Please, Abby." He hadn't called me that since childhood. "Just tell them it was all exaggerated, that Mercer misunderstood who you were." I shook my head. "Caleb, my rank does not protect me from consequences when I fail in duty." His face tightened. "What does that have to do with this?" "Everything." I stepped closer, keeping my voice calm. "If discipline applies only when convenient, it is not discipline at all. It is theater." He looked away. And suddenly I saw it, the exhaustion beneath his polished surface. Years spent performing success for a father whose approval could never truly be earned. Years of compromise disguised as ambition. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I thought if I became enough, he'd finally be proud. The words settled heavily between us. Because I understood them. I had built entire decades around that same impossible hope. And perhaps that was the saddest truth of all. Caleb and I had spent our lives chasing the same ghost in different ways. I placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. "You cannot build a worthy life on borrowed admiration." His eyes filled unexpectedly. Then he nodded once. A small broken gesture. Inside the ballroom, applause suddenly erupted for some new announcement. Life continuing. As it always does. I turned back toward the doors. Behind me, Caleb remained motionless, staring out at the harbor, and perhaps for the first time in his life seeing clearly. Real revenge is rarely loud. It does not humiliate. It does not destroy for pleasure. It simply allows truth to arrive without interference. And when truth finally comes, dignity is often the sharpest blade of all. I did not hear from my father for 3 days. That in itself was unusual. William Reeves had built his life on control. Control of his business affairs. Control of his public image. Control of his home, his family, his expectations. Silence was not his preferred weapon. Correction was. Disappointment was. Measured disapproval delivered with such polished restraint that you often thanked him for it before realizing you had been wounded. As a child, I had spent years studying his moods the way sailors study weather, carefully, instinctively, always preparing for change. And so his silence unsettled me. Not because I feared it. Because I recognized what it usually meant. He was thinking. Really thinking. That Thursday afternoon, I was seated at the harbor residence dining table, reviewing classified briefing notes for my return flight to Washington, when Harris appeared quietly in the doorway. "Ma'am." I looked up. "Your father is here." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I closed the folder. "Thank you, show him in." Harris nodded once and disappeared. A few seconds later, my father entered. He looked older than he had just 4 nights earlier. Not dramatically so. Age rarely announces itself in grand gestures. It reveals itself in subtler ways: the deeper line at the mouth, the slower rise from a chair, the heaviness around the eyes. He was wearing a navy sport coat and pressed khakis, his usual Charleston uniform of careful respectability. But his posture had changed. The certainty was gone. For the first time in my life, he looked unsure of himself. "Abigail." His voice was steady. "Barely." "Father." I gestured toward the opposite chair. He sat. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Outside the windows, the harbor shimmered beneath soft afternoon light. A gull cried somewhere overhead. The world remained indifferent to human reckonings. Finally, he folded his hands carefully on the table. "When your mother was pregnant with you, he said I was certain you'd be a boy. That was not what I expected." I said nothing. He gave a faint, brittle smile. "I had plans for that boy." There was no cruelty in his tone, only honesty. And somehow honesty hurts more. I imagined teaching him the business, watching him carry the family forward, showing him how a Reeves man behaves in Charleston. He looked down briefly. "When you were born, I told myself it made no difference." A long pause. "But it did." The words landed gently, and because they were gentle, they struck deep. He lifted his eyes to mine. "You were bright, strong-willed, independent from the beginning, and instead of admiring those things..." His voice roughened. I resented them. I felt something tighten painfully in my chest. Not anger. Grief. For all the years lost to truths left unsaid. He continued quietly. "Then Caleb was born, and he fit every expectation I understood. Easygoing, charming, eager to please." He gave a small broken laugh. "So I convinced myself that was what strength looked like." Outside, a breeze stirred the harbor grass. Inside, my father's carefully ordered world was coming apart, one sentence at a time. "When you chose Annapolis, I was furious." "I know." He nodded. "No, you knew I was angry. You didn't know why." He drew a slow breath. "I was afraid. That stopped me." He met my eyes directly now. "Because the moment you left, I understood something I could not bear to admit." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "You had become braver than I had ever been." For several seconds, I could not speak. The words struck somewhere deep and ancient inside me, the part of every daughter that waits, however foolishly, to hear her father finally tell the truth. He looked suddenly exhausted. "I spent years pretending your life was lesser because admitting otherwise would mean confronting my own failures." A silence settled between us. Heavy. Necessary. Then, to my complete astonishment, my father's face crumpled. William Reeves did not cry. Not at his own father's funeral. Not when Mother nearly died during surgery 15 years earlier. Not when his business nearly collapsed in the recession. And yet now, sitting across from his daughter in the late afternoon light, tears spilled quietly down his face. "I was proud of you," he said hoarsely. The words broke. He tried again. "I was proud every day." His shoulders shook once. But I did not know how to say it without admitting how wrong I'd been. Something inside me gave way. Not shattered. Released. I had imagined this moment so many times over the years. Usually with triumph. Sometimes with bitterness. Never like this. Never with such profound sadness for what pride had stolen from us both. I reached across the table and covered his trembling hand with mine. His skin felt thinner than I remembered. Older. Real. "I spent half my life trying to earn those words," I said softly. Fresh tears gathered in his eyes. "I know. And eventually," I continued, "I joined the Navy because proving you wrong seemed easier than living small enough to make you comfortable." He closed his eyes. The truth hurt him. As it should. When he opened them again, there was no defensiveness left. Only regret. "Can you forgive me?" It is a strange thing, forgiveness. People imagine it arrives like lightning, sudden and dramatic. Usually it comes quietly like dawn. You look up one day and realize darkness has simply ended. I studied the man who had shaped so much of my life through absence, expectation, and silence. And I saw perhaps for the first time not my father the judge, but William, a flawed man who had inherited narrow ideas of strength and spent too long mistaking them for wisdom. Yes, I said. The word seemed to hollow him with relief. And for the first time since childhood, my father smiled at me without reservation. It was a small smile, but it was real. And sometimes the smallest truths heal the deepest wounds. 3 months later, we returned to the same restaurant. It was my father's idea. When he first suggested it, Mother looked as though he had proposed we dine in the middle of a hurricane. Even Caleb had gone pale. No one wanted to revisit the place where everything had broken open, which was precisely why my father insisted. Some things he said quietly must be faced where they began. And for once, no one argued with him. Charleston was cooler now. October had arrived with its soft southern mercy, easing the summer heat and filling the city with that crisp salt air that always reminds me of football games, church suppers, and old evenings walking home beneath oak trees after dark. I had flown in from Washington that afternoon. Officially, I was there to deliver a lecture at the Citadel on strategic leadership and modern naval operations. Unofficially, I was there because family, if it is to survive, requires showing up. When I arrived at the restaurant just after 7, the same maitre d' greeted me. This time, his expression held visible respect. "Commander Reeves, welcome back." "Thank you." As he led me through the softly lit dining room, I noticed subtle glances from nearby tables. Recognition had spread after the gala. Charleston had learned who Abigail Reeves was. That no longer mattered much to me. What mattered sat waiting at the same corner table where my humiliation had once been served alongside tomato bisque. Mother rose first when she saw me. Her eyes filled instantly. She embraced me tightly longer than Southern form usually allows. "I'm so glad you came." "So am I." When she stepped back, Caleb offered a small, uncertain smile. He looked different. Lighter somehow. Federal prosecutors had negotiated a settlement in exchange for his cooperation against Mercer Development's larger corruption network. He had lost nearly everything financially. Oddly enough, it had made him gentler. Honest struggle often does. He now worked for a local non-profit restoring historic housing for veterans. Less glamorous. Far more real. "Good to see you, Abby." "You too." Then I turned to my father. And for a moment, neither of us moved. He was dressed simply in a charcoal blazer. No performance, no social armor. Just William Reeves. Slowly he stood. Then awkwardly but with absolute sincerity, he raised his right hand in salute. It was not regulation perfect. His elbow was too low. His fingers slightly off alignment. Years ago, I might have corrected him automatically. Instead, I felt my throat tighten. Because what mattered was not precision. It was meaning. This man who had once considered my service an embarrassment was honoring it the best way he knew how. And so I returned the salute. Perfectly. For one breathless second, we simply stood there. Father and daughter. At last, seeing each other clearly. Then his composure cracked. His eyes shone. And he laughed softly through the emotion. "Well," he said, lowering his hand, "I imagine yours looked better." I smiled. Years of practice. The others laughed too. And just like that, something old and wounded finally loosened its grip on all of us. Dinner was simple. Steak for Caleb. Sea bass for Mother. My father ordered soup, which made us all pause for half a second before he looked at me and said, "Well, I'm certainly not throwing it." The table erupted in genuine laughter. Even mine. Especially mine. And that perhaps was the clearest sign of healing. Later, over coffee and pecan pie, we spoke more honestly than we ever had. Mother admitted how often fear had kept her silent when she should have defended me. Caleb apologized without excuses. Not polished apology. Real apology. The kind that does not seek immediate absolution. And Father simply listened. Sometimes that is the greatest repentance a proud man can offer. When dinner ended, we stepped outside beneath Charleston's amber streetlights. The harbor breeze carried the scent of salt and magnolia. For a while, no one spoke. Then Father looked at the dark water and said quietly, "I spent too many years believing strength meant control." He turned toward me. "You taught me it means truth." I looked at him, really looked at him, and understood something that had taken me 52 years to learn. Parents are often just children who grew older without healing properly. And if we are fortunate, life gives us one final chance to understand each other before time runs out. I placed my hand on his arm. We both learned. He nodded. And that was enough. As I boarded my flight back to Washington the next morning, I thought about Derek Mercer. He had accepted a plea deal and was serving probation while completing mandatory veterans service outreach under court supervision. According to Caleb, the work was changing him. I hoped that was true. Because justice without growth is only punishment. And punishment alone teaches very little. If there is anything this story is worth remembering, perhaps it is this. People will often mistake silence for weakness. They will underestimate dignity because it does not shout. They will assume restraint means surrender. Let them. Truth does not need noise to prove itself. It only requires time. And when truth finally arrives, it speaks clearly enough for everyone willing to listen. If this story stirred something in your own heart, if it reminded you of someone who deserves forgiveness, or perhaps someone from whom forgiveness must still be asked, I hope you'll reflect on that tonight. And if these stories mean something to you, share them with someone who might need the reminder that grace is not weakness, and truth always finds its voice. Thank you for listening. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you know where to find us. The room went so quiet I could hear the ice melting in somebody's bourbon glass. Young lady, are you aware he's married? My father's voice wasn't loud. That was the frightening part. General Arthur Bennett had spent 40 years commanding men in war zones, briefing presidents, and standing in rooms where a whisper carried more weight than shouting ever could. Across my living room, the young blonde woman sitting beside my husband turned scarlet. Ethan said they were basically separated. That's interesting, my father replied calmly. My husband went pale. Sir, I can explain. I stood near the fireplace, gripping the edge of the mantel so hard my wedding ring cut into my skin. Just 20 minutes earlier, I'd been upstairs changing into pearl earrings for what Ethan told me was a small dinner gathering with potential business clients. Then I walked downstairs and found another woman sitting at my dining table drinking wine from my crystal glasses. Not just sitting there comfortably, smiling, like she belonged there. And my husband of 32 years, had the nerve to introduce her as someone important to his future. At 60 years old, I thought I understood humiliation. Marriage teaches you compromises, aging teaches you disappointments. But nothing prepares you for standing in your own home while the man you built a life with parades another woman through your front door like you're already invisible. Especially after everything you sacrificed for him. Especially after all the years you stayed quiet so he could feel important. I should probably tell you that my husband Ethan had no idea who my father really was. That sounds impossible, doesn't it? But it's true. When Ethan met me in 1993, I was teaching history at a small private school outside Alexandria, Virginia. My father had already retired from the Air Force by then. My parents lived quietly on a horse farm in Middleburg. No security detail, no flashy wealth, no newspaper interviews. My father hated attention. He always said real accomplishment didn't need an audience. So Ethan assumed my parents were simply reserved older Virginians with military manners and modest money. I never corrected him. Not because I was ashamed, quite the opposite. I loved that my parents valued simplicity. My mother still clipped grocery coupons despite having more money than most people in our county. My father drove an old Ford pickup and spent Saturday mornings repairing fences himself. That was the world I grew up in. Quiet dignity. Service before appearance. Character before status. Unfortunately, Ethan slowly became a different man. When we were younger, he was warm and ambitious in a charming way. He sold commercial real estate around Northern Virginia and dreamed of building something meaningful. I admired that about him. Back then, he laughed easily. He loved old jazz records and Sunday drives through the Shenandoah Valley. But success changed him little by little. Or maybe it simply revealed who he already was. As the years passed, Ethan became obsessed with appearances. Bigger houses, better clubs, more influential friends. He started measuring human value by job titles and dinner invitations. And lately he'd become fascinated with politics. Especially powerful people. 3 months earlier, he started mentioning Senator Marcus Whitmore constantly. Apparently, Whitmore's daughter worked in nonprofit fundraising and had excellent Washington connections. That daughter was now sitting in my living room wearing a cream-colored dress and looking terrified of my father. Her name was Vanessa. She couldn't have been older than 35. Young enough to still believe charm could rescue her from consequences. Ethan wiped nervous sweat from his forehead. General Bennett, I never intended for this to become disrespectful. My mother finally spoke from beside the doorway. Bringing your mistress into your wife's home usually qualifies as disrespectful. Her tone was elegant and composed, which somehow made it worse. My mother, Eleanor Bennett, had mastered the art of polite devastation decades ago. Vanessa stood abruptly clutching her purse. I think I should leave. Yes, my mother said immediately. I believe you should. Vanessa looked at Ethan, probably expecting him to defend her. He didn't. Cowardice ages a man quickly. In those few minutes, Ethan suddenly looked older than his 64 years. His shoulders slumped, his confidence vanished. The polished businessman who spent years lecturing waiters and bragging at country club dinners looked like a frightened teenager caught stealing. Vanessa hurried toward the front door. Before leaving, she glanced at me with genuine embarrassment. Oddly enough, I didn't hate her. Not really. Because standing there looking at Ethan, I realized something painful. This wasn't about Vanessa. There would always have been another Vanessa eventually. Another younger woman to impress. Another audience for his ego. The real betrayal had begun years ago when Ethan stopped valuing the life we built together. The front door closed softly behind her. Silence settled across the room again. My father looked at Ethan steadily. You threatened my daughter tonight. Ethan blinked quickly. Sir, You told her not to anger a senator. My father took one slow step forward. Son, I buried pilots before you finished college. Do not mistake me for a man intimidated by politicians. I almost closed my eyes at that moment because I recognized the voice. Calm, controlled, dangerous. The command voice. I hadn't heard it in years. Ethan swallowed hard. Claire never told me. No, my father interrupted. She didn't. Because unlike some people, our family doesn't treat influence as decoration. My chest tightened unexpectedly. Even now, after walking into this disaster, my father wasn't bragging. He was defending values, defending me. That realization nearly broke me more than Ethan's betrayal. Because suddenly I understood how lonely I'd become inside my marriage. I used to make excuses for Ethan constantly. He's under stress. He didn't mean it that way. He's worried about retirement. But standing there that evening, I finally saw the truth clearly. A good man under pressure becomes tired. A selfish man under pressure reveals himself. My mother crossed the room and touched my arm gently. Claire, sweetheart, when did you last eat? Such a small question. Such a mother question. And for some reason, that was what finally cracked me open. I started crying right there beside the fireplace at 60 years old like a heartbroken girl. Not dramatic sobbing. Just exhausted tears. My father's expression softened instantly. Ethan stepped toward me. Claire. I held up my hand. No. One word. But it stopped him cold. Because for 32 years I had always eventually softened, always listened, always forgiven. This time was different. I looked directly at my husband. You didn't just betray me, Ethan, I said quietly. You humiliated me in my own home. His eyes filled with panic then. Real panic. Not because he suddenly loved me correctly. Because he finally understood he might actually lose me. And deep down, men like Ethan always assume there will be one more chance. He didn't know yet there wouldn't be. I barely slept that night. After my parents left the house, felt unfamiliar like a hotel room after an argument. The grandfather clock in the hallway sounded louder than usual. Every creak in the floorboards made my nerves jump. Ethan slept downstairs in his office, or at least I assumed he tried to. Around 3 a.m, I walked quietly into the kitchen for tea and found him sitting alone at the table in darkness, staring into an untouched glass of scotch. For a moment he looked old. Not distinguished old, not confident old. Just tired. The kind of tired that settles into a man after he realizes the story he told himself about his life is collapsing. He looked up when I entered. Claire. I said nothing and reached for the kettle. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I kept my eyes on the stove, for which part? The silence after that question stretched painfully. For all of it. I laughed once under my breath. Not because anything was funny, but because men often discover sincerity only after consequences arrive. 32 years of marriage teaches you how to hear the difference between guilt and regret. Guilt says I hurt you. Regret says I got caught. I still didn't know which one Ethan felt. He rubbed both hands over his face. "You have every right to hate me." "I don't hate you." That surprised both of us. Because it was true. Hatred requires energy. What I felt was something colder, a deep disappointment that hollowed me out from the inside. I poured hot water into my mug carefully. "You know what hurts most?" I asked quietly. Ethan looked up. "You thought I'd tolerate it." His jaw tightened. "You honestly believed you could bring another woman into this house and I'd stay quiet because her father was powerful." "Claire, that's not." That is exactly what happened. For years, Ethan had slowly mistaken my calmness for weakness. That realization hurt worse than the affair itself. When we were younger, Ethan used to admire my steadiness. He'd tell friends I could stay calm through anything. During hard years, his business failures in the early 2000s, my mother's cancer, scare the death of his older brother, I was the one who held our life together quietly. But somewhere along the line, my steadiness stopped looking like strength to him. It started looking like surrender. "I never meant to humiliate you," he whispered. I turned toward him finally. "Well, you did." Simple truth sounds heavier after midnight. He looked down again. "You don't understand how things got out of hand." I almost answered sharply. Instead, I sat across from him with my tea between my hands. "No," I said calmly, "I think I finally do." Outside the kitchen window, rain tapped softly against the glass. Northern Virginia rain in late October always carried a certain loneliness with it. Ethan stared toward the dark backyard. I felt invisible. There it was. Not love. Not passion. Vanity. "I'm 64 years old," he continued quietly. "Young people in this business look right through me now. New money, tech people, political donors, everyone chasing the next thing." I listened without interrupting. Then Vanessa started paying attention to me, laughing at my stories, asking for advice. His voice cracked slightly. She made me feel important again. That sentence told me everything. Not because it excused him. Because it exposed him. I remembered the man I married at 31. Ethan had once been kind to everyone. He volunteered coaching Little League. He visited his mother every Sunday after church. He used to bring me daisies from roadside flower stands because he remembered I loved simple things. But over time, Ethan became addicted to admiration. And admiration is a dangerous drug for aging people. Especially in America, where growing older often makes people feel discarded. I softened slightly despite myself. Not enough to forgive him, but enough to understand him. And understanding someone after they hurt you can feel almost cruel. "You should have talked to me," I said quietly. "I know. But instead you chose humiliation." His eyes filled with shame. "I didn't think you'd ever leave." That sentence landed harder than the affair. Because it was true. Ethan had spent decades believing my loyalty was unconditional. And maybe I had taught him that. Not intentionally, but still. Women of my generation were raised differently. We were taught marriage required endurance, patience, sacrifice, quietness. Especially military daughters like me. My mother endured long deployments without complaint. She moved across countries repeatedly. She raised children alone during dangerous years while my father served overseas. Strength in our world looked quiet. Maybe too quiet sometimes. "I need some space," I finally said. Ethan nodded immediately, of course. "I mean real space." His face tightened. "You're leaving." "No, you are." He stared at me like the idea had genuinely never occurred to him. This was my house too, my kitchen, my life. And for the first time in decades, I felt the weight of my own dignity returning slowly to my spine. The next morning, Ethan packed 2 suitcases. Watching your husband fold sweaters into luggage after 32 years together feels surreal. Ordinary objects suddenly become evidence of failure. He paused at the bedroom doorway before leaving. Claire, did you really never tell me about your family because you didn't care about status? I looked up from the bed where I sat holding one of our old wedding albums. Yes. His eyes searched mine. I don't understand that. I know. That was the tragedy of it. My father used to say character reveals itself most clearly through what people cannot understand. Ethan couldn't understand why power wasn't the center of our lives, which meant he never truly understood me either. After he left, the silence inside the house became enormous. I wandered room to room touching furniture, photographs, bookshelves. 32 years of marriage lived inside those walls. Family vacations. Christmas mornings. Dinner parties. Arguments. Recoveries. Promises. I stopped in front of our wedding portrait hanging in the hallway. We looked so young. So certain. For a brief moment, grief hit me so hard I had to sit down. Not grief for the man standing in my living room yesterday. Grief for the man I thought he used to be. Around noon, my mother arrived carrying homemade soup because of course she did. Mothers from her generation always brought food to heartbreak. She found me sitting at the dining table still wearing the same sweater from the night before. Without a word, she placed the soup on the stove and sat beside me. Then she took my hand. And I cried again. Quietly this time. I feel foolish, I whispered. My mother squeezed my fingers gently. Claire Bennett, she said softly, there is nothing foolish about loving someone fully. That sentence stayed with me. Because older women carry enough shame already. Shame about aging, about staying too long, about trusting too much. But maybe love itself was never the shameful part. Maybe betrayal belonged entirely to the betrayer. That afternoon my father called. I've arranged for an attorney to meet with you whenever you're ready. I closed my eyes briefly. Dad believed in preparation, always. You already knew this might happen, didn't you? A pause. Then he answered honestly. I knew Ethan was becoming the kind of man who valued appearances too much. That hurt because deep down I'd known it too. I just kept hoping love would correct it. But love doesn't change character. It only reveals it over time. 3 days after Ethan moved out, I met with the divorce attorney my father recommended. Her office sat in an old red brick building near Georgetown, elegant without trying too hard. The kind of place with polished wood floors, framed law degrees, and a receptionist who spoke softly enough to make everyone else lower their voices too. Her name was Diane Mercer. Late 60s, silver bob haircut, pearl earrings. Competence radiated off her like heat. I knew your father years ago, she said as she poured coffee into thin white china cups, back when Washington still had adults in the room. That made me smile for the first time in days. Diane opened a thick folder in front of her. Before we discuss strategy, she said carefully, I need to ask you something important. I nodded. Do you want revenge or do you want peace? The question startled me. Because up until then I thought they were the same thing. I looked out the window toward the gray Potomac River below. I don't know yet. Diane gave a slow understanding nod. That's honest. Honest is good. Then she slid several financial documents across the desk toward me. I stared at them in confusion. These are Ethan's business accounts, she explained, and these are yours. Mine were significantly larger. I blinked several times. Even though I understood my family's financial structure generally, I had never focused much on the numbers. My father handled most investments through family trusts, established long before I was born. Diane adjusted her glasses. Claire, do you realize your husband's company would have failed nearly 12 years ago without distributions from your personal trust? I looked up sharply. What? She pointed calmly to several documents. Capital injections, quiet debt coverage, tax protections. Most of Ethan's major business recoveries were indirectly supported by your family assets. I stared at the papers in disbelief. Not because I doubted her. Because I suddenly understood something humiliating. Ethan had spent years acting superior while unknowingly surviving because of me. Or more accurately, because of the quiet stability my family provided. I never even told him, I murmured. Diane folded her hands carefully. Your father requested discretion. That sounded exactly like him. No performance. No reminders. No making a man feel small. The Bennetts believed helping family quietly was part of responsibility. Unfortunately, some people mistake silent support for weakness. Diane studied me for a moment. You still love him. It wasn't a question. And against all logic, tears burned my eyes again. Yes. That was the terrible part. Love doesn't disappear simply because trust does. People my age understand that better than younger generations sometimes do. After 32 years, a marriage becomes stitched into your nervous system. You don't just lose a spouse. You lose routines, shared language, history. You lose the witness to your life. Diane handed me a tissue gently. You can love someone and still leave them. I nodded slowly. That afternoon I drove aimlessly through Northern Virginia for nearly 2 hours, past old churches, shopping centers, quiet suburban neighborhoods where Halloween decorations already sat on porches. Ordinary American life continued around me as if my world hadn't cracked open. I finally parked outside a small diner near Fairfax where Ethan and I used to eat breakfast after church on Sundays years ago. The waitress recognized me immediately. Haven't seen you two in forever. The sentence hit harder than she intended. I forced a smile and ordered coffee. Sitting there alone in the booth, I found myself remembering the early years of our marriage before ambition hardened Ethan into someone restless and dissatisfied. Back then, we didn't have much money. Our first apartment had thin walls and unreliable heat. Ethan drove a used Buick with a door that only opened from the outside. We spent summers drinking cheap wine on the balcony while listening to baseball games on the radio. And we were happy. Or at least I thought we were. I remembered helping Ethan practice presentations late at night when he first entered commercial real estate. I edited proposals, balanced budgets, encouraged him after failed deals. When his first company nearly collapsed in 2008, he sat at our kitchen table crying quietly because he thought he'd failed me. I held his hand and said, "We'll survive." And we did. Because my father quietly arranged financial protections without Ethan ever knowing. Not to deceive him. To preserve his pride. I stared down into my coffee. The saddest part wasn't that Ethan never appreciated my family's help. The saddest part was that he never valued the woman standing beside him enough to notice her strength. That evening, my parents invited me to their farm for dinner. The Bennett farm sat outside Middleburg, surrounded by rolling fields, white fences, and old maple trees just beginning to turn gold with autumn. My father bought the property after retirement because he said, after decades of war rooms and military bases, he wanted silence. Real silence. Not Washington silence. As I pulled into the driveway, my father stood near the barn repairing a fence post himself, despite being 72 years old. Some men retire into golf memberships. My father retired into work boots. He waved as I approached. "How'd the meeting go?" "Expensive," I answered dryly. That earned a laugh. We walked slowly together toward the house. "You know," Dad said after a moment, "when I first met Ethan, I liked him." "I know. He loved you sincerely once." The ache in my chest returned immediately. "I think so too." Dad stopped walking. "Claire, people aren't only one thing. A man can love his wife and still become selfish." I looked at him carefully. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No," he gave a tired smile, "just accurate." That was another thing about my father. Military command had stripped him of simplistic thinking decades ago. Life wasn't divided neatly into heroes and villains. Weakness and loneliness could corrupt people slowly over time. Inside the farmhouse, my mother made pot roast and fresh biscuits. The house smelled like rosemary and butter and wood smoke. Safe smells. Healing smells. At dinner, they didn't pressure me about the divorce. They didn't criticize Ethan endlessly either. That surprised me. Finally, halfway through dessert, I asked the question sitting heavily inside me. "Why didn't you ever tell Ethan who you really were?" My mother smiled softly. "Because we wanted him to love you for yourself. And if a man values you less because he thinks your family is ordinary," my father added quietly, "then eventually he'll reveal something ugly about himself." I lowered my eyes. He did. Dad reached across the table and squeezed my hand once. "Yes," he said gently, "he did." Later that night, after my parents went to bed, I sat alone on the farmhouse porch, wrapped in one of my mother's quilts. The Virginia countryside stretched dark and peaceful around me. For the first time since the dinner party, I realized something surprising. I wasn't afraid anymore. Heartbroken, yes. Embarrassed sometimes. Angry occasionally. But not afraid. Because somewhere underneath all the grief, I had started remembering who I was before I spent decades shrinking myself to protect a man's ego. And that woman, I realized quietly, was still there. A week later, I found myself standing beside my father at Arlington National Cemetery. The wind carried that particular October chill unique to Virginia, sharp enough to make you pull your coat tighter, gentle enough to remind you winter hadn't fully arrived yet. Rows of white headstones stretched across the hills in perfect order. Every time I came there, the silence humbled me. Not empty silence. Earned silence. My father walked slowly beside me with his hands folded behind his back. Even retired for nearly 15 years, he still moved like a military officer, measured, alert, disciplined. We stopped near the gravesite of one of his closest friends, a pilot he'd served with decades earlier. Dad crouched carefully despite his stiff knees and brushed a few fallen leaves from the headstone. "He never got to grow old," he said quietly. That sentence settled heavily between us. At 60, I'd started noticing how often conversations among older Americans turned toward time: retirement, illness, grandchildren, loss. We spend so much of youth imagining life ahead that eventually it shocks us to realize more years sit behind us than in front. Maybe that's why Ethan panicked. Not because he was evil. Because aging frightened him. Unfortunately, fear can make selfish people dangerous. "You still thinking about him?" my father asked gently as we continued walking. "Yes." "That's normal." I gave him a sideways glance. "You're remarkably calm about all this." Dad smiled faintly. "Claire, I spent 40 years watching human beings make mistakes under pressure. Mistresses aren't exactly battlefield decisions." "No," he admitted, "but pride is pride, ego is ego." We walked quietly for a few moments. Then Dad stopped near a large oak tree overlooking the cemetery hills. "You know what war teaches you eventually." I shook my head. "Nobody is impressive forever." The breeze rustled through the branches above us. "Titles disappear," he continued softly. "Uniforms disappear, beauty disappears, strength fades. Character is what stays behind." I felt tears sting unexpectedly. Because deep down, I knew that was exactly what Ethan had lost sight of. And maybe what I had forgotten too. That afternoon, I drove to the Veterans Hospital in Washington for the first time in years. My mother volunteered there every Thursday, helping elderly spouses complete paperwork and insurance forms. After retirement, my father occasionally visited wounded veterans quietly without publicity. I used to help during holidays when life was less busy. Before my marriage became maintenance instead of partnership. The hospital smelled faintly of coffee disinfectant and old linoleum floors. Familiar somehow, honest. My mother greeted me warmly near the volunteer office. "Oh, good," she said immediately. "Mrs. Talbot's hearing aid paperwork has become a nightmare. You're better at forms than I am." That made me laugh softly. And strangely, laughter felt unfamiliar now. Like using muscles I hadn't stretched in years. For the next few hours, I sat with elderly veterans and their families, helping sort documents, insurance claims, transportation requests. Ordinary problems. Real problems. One man named Frank kept calling me young lady despite being only 15 years older than me. Another veteran showed me photographs of his grandchildren for 20 straight minutes while forgetting my name entirely. And somehow being around those people soothed something inside me. No performance. No social climbing. No pretending. Just human beings trying to carry life with dignity. Around 3 o'clock, a woman named Margaret sat beside me in the cafeteria. She looked to be in her 70s, sharp-eyed with short gray curls and a denim jacket covered in volunteer pins. "You're Arthur Bennett's daughter," she said immediately. I nodded. "He helped my husband years ago." "Really?" Margaret smiled warmly. "My Harold came home from Vietnam carrying more ghosts than luggage. Your father got him into counseling before anybody else would admit veterans needed it." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. My father rarely talked about those years. Margaret stirred cream into her coffee slowly. "Good men don't advertise kindness," she said. "That's how you know it's real." I thought about Ethan instantly. About expensive dinners, loud networking events, constant conversations about influence and visibility. Somewhere along the line, he'd confused attention with importance. Margaret tilted her head carefully. "You look heartbroken." Older people stop pretending not to notice pain. I smiled sadly, that obvious. Honey, I'm 76, nothing subtle anymore. That made me laugh again. Then somehow I found myself telling her pieces of the story. Not every humiliating detail. Just enough. Margaret listened quietly without interrupting. Finally, she patted my hand. Men panic when they age, she said matter-of-factly. Some buy Corvettes, some chase younger women, some become grumpy old fools. And some grow wiser. I looked down at my coffee. I'm not sure Ethan will. Margaret shrugged gently. That's his tragedy, not yours. That sentence followed me home. 2 days later, Ethan called unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer. But after 32 years, ignoring his name on my phone felt impossible. Hello? His voice sounded tired immediately. Claire, thank you for not destroying me publicly. I frowned slightly. I never wanted to destroy you. A long pause. I think that somehow makes this worse. I leaned back slowly in my chair. How's the apartment? Small. That nearly made me smile despite myself. Ethan had always hated small spaces. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I lost the Franklin contract. I closed my eyes briefly. The Franklin contract was huge, nearly 40% of his consulting income. I'm sorry, I said automatically. And I meant it. That surprised me. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. You know what's pathetic? Half the people avoiding me now were never real friends to begin with. There it was. The loneliness underneath vanity. I didn't answer immediately. Finally, I said quietly, that's what happens when relationships are built on appearances. Silence. Then softly, you warned me about that years ago. I remembered the conversation instantly. A charity gala in Georgetown nearly 12 years earlier. Ethan spent the entire evening chasing conversations with influential donors while ignoring longtime friends seated beside us. On the drive home, I told him, people who only value status eventually abandon each other the moment status disappears. At the time, he laughed it off. Now he sounded broken remembering it. Claire, he said carefully, did you ever feel invisible with me? The question stunned me, because he had never asked anything like that before. And the truthful answer hurt. Yes. Silence filled the line again. Not defensive silence, painful silence. The kind older couples eventually recognize the silence that arrives when truth finally outweighs pride. When we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time staring out my living room window. Marriage is strange that way. Sometimes people don't really begin seeing each other clearly until everything falls apart. That evening, my mother called and invited me for Sunday dinner again. Before hanging up, she added gently, your father's making chili. Try to act impressed. I smiled to myself afterward. And for the first time in weeks, the future didn't feel entirely dark. Not healed. Not settled. But survivable. At our age, sometimes hope arrives quietly. Not as excitement. As peace. By early December, Ethan's business had officially begun to collapse. Not dramatically. That's the thing younger people misunderstand about failure. Most lives don't explode overnight. They erode quietly. One canceled contract. One unanswered phone call. One invitation that suddenly stops arriving. At our age, you notice those absences immediately. Ethan certainly did. I heard pieces of the story through mutual friends first. A developer in McLean ended their consulting agreement. 2 longtime clients moved to another firm. A charity board quietly replaced him before the annual gala. Washington has always specialized in elegant exile. Nobody says you're unwelcome. They simply stop calling. I wish I could tell you I enjoyed hearing about it. Part of me expected revenge to feel satisfying. But mostly it felt sad. 32 years is a long time to watch someone slowly become a stranger. One rainy afternoon, Ethan came by the house to collect more belongings. I nearly didn't open the door when I saw him standing there through the window. He looked thinner. His expensive camel overcoat hung loosely around his shoulders, and for the first time in decades, his hair looked genuinely gray instead of carefully managed. Aging arrives quickly once vanity loses its audience. Hi, he said awkwardly when I opened the door. Hello? For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I stepped aside silently. He walked into the foyer slowly, like a visitor instead of a husband. The Christmas decorations were already up, garland along the staircase, White lights around the mantel, the same decorations I'd unpacked every December since 1994. Ethan stared at them quietly. "You always made Christmas beautiful." The comment hit me unexpectedly hard. Because it was true. For decades, I created warmth around him while he chased admiration elsewhere. He walked upstairs while I remained in the kitchen pretending to organize mail. A few minutes later, I heard drawers opening in the bedroom. Then silence. Then another drawer. 32 years of shared life reduced to deciding which sweaters belonged to whom. Eventually, he came downstairs carrying 2 boxes. He paused near the dining room doorway. "Do you remember our first Christmas here?" Of course I remembered. We bought the house in 1998 after years of saving. It wasn't enormous by Washington standards, but I loved it immediately. Wide front porch, tall windows, old oak trees in the backyard. That first Christmas, we couldn't afford proper furniture yet, so we ate dinner sitting on folding chairs beside the fireplace. "Yes," I answered quietly. Ethan gave a tired smile. "You made tomato soup because we spent all our money on the down payment. And you burned the grilled cheese sandwiches." "That too." For one painful second, the old version of us returned. Not the polished couple from charity galas. Just 2 people trying to build a life together. Then reality settled back into the room again. Ethan looked down. "I threw away something good, didn't I?" I answered honestly. "Yes." His eyes closed briefly. "I keep thinking if I explain myself correctly, maybe this will make sense somehow." "It won't." He nodded slowly like he already knew that. Then he looked at me carefully. "Do you hate her?" "Vanessa." He nodded. I surprised myself by answering immediately. "No." That seemed to genuinely confuse him. "She knew you were married," he said quietly. "Yes, but she didn't stand before me 32 years ago and promise loyalty." That landed hard. Ethan looked away toward the Christmas tree blinking softly in the corner. "I don't think I understood what loyalty cost you." The sentence settled heavily between us. Because women of my generation understand loyalty differently than many younger people do. We stayed through layoffs, illness, aging parents, financial strain, exhaustion, quiet disappointments. We kept marriages alive through ordinary endurance. Not because we were weak, because we believed commitment mattered. And maybe sometimes we tolerated too much because of it. "I wasn't unhappy all those years," Ethan said suddenly. I looked at him. "That almost makes this worse." His face crumpled slightly. "I know." Before leaving, he hesitated near the front door. "The apartment feels empty." I folded my arms gently. "That's what consequences feel like sometimes." He nodded once and walked out into the rain carrying his boxes. I watched from the doorway until his car disappeared down the street. Then I closed the door and stood there crying quietly where he couldn't see me. Not because I wanted him back. Because grief doesn't disappear simply because betrayal exists. A week later, I finalized preliminary divorce agreements with Diane Mercer. We sat together in her office reviewing financial settlements. "You're being extremely generous," Diane observed carefully. "I don't need to punish him financially." She studied me over her glasses. "You could." "I know. And I could have." Legally, much of Ethan's lifestyle had depended indirectly on structures connected to my family's trusts and investments. But stripping him completely felt cruel. My father was surprised when I told him my decision later that evening. "You owe him nothing," he said firmly. "Maybe not." Dad looked at me carefully across the farmhouse kitchen table. "Then why?" I stared down at my coffee for a long moment before answering. "Because I loved him once." The room grew quiet. My mother reached over and touched my hand softly. Mercy becomes easier once anger finishes burning. That doesn't mean forgiveness arrives quickly. Only that revenge eventually grows exhausting. A few days before Christmas, Ethan called again. This time his voice sounded different. Smaller somehow. "I lost the apartment." I sat upright immediately. What happened? "I can't afford it anymore." The words seemed painful for him to say aloud. A man who spent years projecting success now admitting financial instability. "I found a smaller place in Arlington," he added quickly. "It's temporary." I leaned back slowly. "Do you need help moving?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. Long silence. Then very quietly. "Why are you still kind to me?" I looked out the window toward falling snow beginning to cover the backyard. Because despite everything, kindness still felt more natural to me than cruelty. Because being cruel won't heal me, I answered honestly. He made a sound that almost resembled breaking. That Christmas Eve, I spent the evening at my parents' farmhouse. The house glowed warmly against the cold Virginia night. My mother baked pecan pie while old Nat King Cole records played softly in the background. My father fell asleep in his armchair halfway through a football game. Ordinary things. Comforting things. At one point, I stood alone by the window watching snow drift across the fields. And suddenly I realized something important. For months I'd been thinking of my life as something destroyed. But maybe it wasn't destroyed. Maybe it was simply changing shape. Painfully. Unexpectedly. But not hopelessly. At 60 years old, that realization felt strangely liberating. Because there's still life after heartbreak. Still purpose after disappointment. Still peace waiting somewhere beyond humiliation. You just have to survive long enough to reach it. By February, the sharpest part of winter had settled over Virginia. The trees outside my bedroom window stood bare and skeletal against pale morning skies, and the quiet after snowfall seemed to soften everything, even grief. I had moved into a smaller home by then. Not because I needed to financially. Because I wanted simplicity. After Ethan left, the old house began feeling too large for one person. Too full of echoes. Every hallway carried memories I wasn't ready to trip over daily. So I bought a modest historic cottage near Middleburg, only 15 minutes from my parents' farm. White shutters, stone walkway, small library room with built-in shelves I immediately loved. For the first time in years, the house belonged entirely to me. No entertaining schedules. No business dinners. No pretending. Just peace. Most mornings I drank coffee beside the kitchen window while watching birds gather near the feeder outside. It sounds small, but after decades of tension, I'd barely acknowledged quiet became a kind of medicine. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I volunteered at the Veterans Center with my mother. That's where I met Daniel Harper. The first thing I noticed about Daniel was his voice. Calm voices matter when you get older. He spoke slowly, thoughtfully, without the exhausting performance so many people carry now. A retired Navy physician in his late 60s, Daniel volunteered twice a week helping elderly veterans navigate medical paperwork and transportation issues. The second thing I noticed was that he listened fully when people spoke. That quality has become rare. We met over a broken coffee machine in the volunteer lounge. It only works if you threaten it first, he told me solemnly while smacking the side lightly. To my surprise, the machine sputtered back to life immediately. I laughed. Years of medical training. Navy medicine, he corrected. We learned improvisation. His smile was warm but unassuming. No flashy charm. No effort to impress. And after everything with Ethan, that steadiness felt unexpectedly comforting. Over the following weeks, Daniel and I developed an easy friendship. We ate lunch together sometimes in the hospital cafeteria, talking mostly about ordinary things. Books. Music. Adult children leaving home. The strange invisibility that comes with aging in America. Daniel had been widowed 6 years earlier after nearly 40 years of marriage. She hated hospitals, he told me once with amused sadness, which was inconvenient considering she married a doctor. I smiled softly. Were you happy? With her? He nodded slowly. Yes, not every day, but overall yes. That answer stayed with me because it sounded honest. Not romanticized. Real. Older people understand happiness differently. We stop expecting constant excitement. We begin valuing consistency, safety, companionship. Peace becomes more attractive than passion eventually. One afternoon after volunteering, Daniel and I walked slowly through downtown Middleburg, carrying cups of coffee while snow melted along the sidewalks. You seem lighter lately, he observed gently. I looked at him carefully. I think I'm finally breathing normally again. He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. Long marriages can become heavy, he said quietly, even good ones. I appreciated that he didn't immediately criticize Ethan. Most people wanted villains and victims because simple stories feel easier to process. But real marriages rarely collapse from one moment alone. Sometimes they erode slowly under unspoken disappointments. Meanwhile, Ethan had started seeing a therapist. I learned that accidentally during one of our occasional phone calls regarding financial paperwork. I almost walked out after 10 minutes, he admitted awkwardly. I nearly smiled imagining it. Ethan hated vulnerability. What changed your mind? The line stayed quiet briefly. The therapist asked me why I needed strangers to admire me so badly. That sounded uncomfortably accurate. And apparently the answer takes 50-minute sessions to explain. For the first time in months, I heard genuine self-awareness in his voice. Not excuses. Not blame. Reflection. Healing often begins with humiliation, unfortunately. Especially for proud people. Around that same time, Ethan reconnected with his younger brother Michael after nearly 7 years of estrangement. The brothers stopped speaking over something ridiculous involving inheritance disagreements after Ethan's mother died. Pride destroys families in slow motion. One Sunday evening, Ethan called unexpectedly while I cooked soup in my small kitchen. I had dinner with Michael. I stirred the pot slowly. How'd it go? He hugged me. Emotion cracked unexpectedly in his voice. We haven't hugged since Dad's funeral. I leaned quietly against the counter. He said something interesting. What? He said I spent years chasing people who didn't care about me while ignoring the ones who did. The truth sounded painful even secondhand. Outside my kitchen window, snow began falling softly again. I think he's right, Ethan whispered. That conversation haunted me afterward. Because despite everything, part of me still mourned for the man Ethan could have remained if he'd valued the right things. A few days later, my father came by the cottage carrying groceries I didn't ask for because retired military fathers apparently express love through unnecessary supplies. You living entirely on soup now? He asked suspiciously while unpacking canned goods. I'm 60, not 23. Your cooking habits suggest otherwise. I laughed and handed him coffee. Dad wandered slowly through the cottage approvingly. This place suits you. I think so too. He stopped beside the bookshelf in the living room. You seem peaceful. The observation surprised me because it was true. Not fully healed, but steadier. I spent years shrinking parts of myself without realizing it, I admitted quietly. Dad nodded once. That happens in marriages sometimes. I kept protecting Ethan's ego. And who protected yours? The question hit deep. Because I genuinely didn't know. Women of my generation were often taught emotional caretaking so thoroughly that eventually we stopped noticing our own exhaustion. Dad sat heavily in the armchair near the window. You know why your mother and I survived all these years? I smiled faintly, fear. That too. Then his expression softened warmly. But mostly because neither of us needed the world to constantly prove our value. That was the difference. My parents built their marriage around partnership. Ethan built much of his identity around validation. And validation disappears quickly with age. That evening after Dad left, I sat quietly by the fireplace thinking about the strange shape life had taken. 6 months earlier, I believed my marriage defined me completely. Now I was learning something unexpected. There could still be joy after betrayal. Still friendship. Still meaning. Still mornings filled with peace instead of anxiety. At 60 years old, I had assumed most major transformations were behind me. Instead, life quietly handed me another beginning. And for the first time in a very long while, I wasn't afraid of the future anymore. 1 year after Ethan brought Vanessa into my home, autumn returned to Virginia. The maple trees around Middleburg had turned deep shades of gold and rust again, and cool air drifted through open windows carrying the smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves. I used to think heartbreak permanently divided life into before and after. Now I understood something gentler. Life keeps moving. Not because pain disappears, because people learn how to carry it differently. That October evening, I attended a military charity fundraiser in Washington, honoring veterans and long-term military spouses. My mother convinced me to go after 3 days of persistent encouragement, and one particularly effective guilt trip involving her homemade lemon cake. Daniel attended with me. Not as some dramatic late-life romance. Just quietly. Comfortably. That mattered more. At our age, companionship becomes less about fireworks and more about ease. Daniel never tried to rescue me from my sadness or compete with my memories. He simply showed up consistently, which I had come to realize was one of the purest forms of love. The ballroom overlooked the Potomac River, glowing softly beneath crystal chandeliers and muted conversations. Retired officers, diplomats, widows, volunteers, and old military families filled the room. Familiar worlds, steady worlds. Daniel handed me a glass of sparkling water. "You nervous?" "A little." "You'll survive." That sounds medically reassuring. Navy medicine specialized in confidence over certainty. I laughed softly. Then I saw Ethan standing near the far side of the ballroom. For one suspended moment, everything inside me went still. He looked older. Not ruined, just humbled. His hair had gone almost entirely gray now, and the sharp arrogance he once carried so naturally had disappeared. Instead, he stood quietly speaking with an elderly veteran in a wheelchair. Listening carefully. Actually listening. Daniel noticed my expression immediately. "That him?" "Yes." He nodded gently. "You want to leave?" I considered it honestly, then shook my head. "No. Because healing eventually means reclaiming spaces that once hurt you, not avoiding them forever." About 20 minutes later, Ethan approached carefully. "Claire." "Hello, Ethan." His eyes shifted politely toward Daniel. "Good evening." Daniel extended his hand immediately. "Daniel Harper." "Ethan Collins." The men shook hands calmly. No hostility. No territorial tension. Just two older men understanding life had already humbled both of them in different ways. "I'll go rescue your mother from political conversations," Daniel told me quietly before stepping away. God, I appreciated that man. Ethan watched him go. "He seems kind." "He is." For a moment we stood together awkwardly beside the ballroom windows overlooking the river. Then Ethan exhaled slowly. "I almost didn't come tonight." "Why did you?" He looked down briefly. "I volunteer with a veterans housing program now. They invited me." I nodded softly. "I heard." Over the past several months, Ethan had begun working with struggling veterans through a community outreach organization. At first, I assumed guilt drove him there. Maybe it did. But sometimes people begin changing for imperfect reasons and still become better. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. I folded my hands together patiently. A real one this time. The honesty in that sentence immediately caught my attention. No excuses. No self-pity. Just accountability. Ethan swallowed hard. "What I did to you was cruel, not just selfish. Cruel." Emotion flickered across his face. I humiliated the person who loved me most because I was terrified of getting older and becoming irrelevant. I stayed silent. Not to punish him. To let him continue. I spent years needing strangers to admire me because somewhere along the line I stopped respecting myself. His voice lowered further. "And instead of facing that, honestly, I hurt you." There it was. The truth at last. Simple. Uncomfortable. Real. The ballroom noise softened around us as if distance suddenly separated us from everyone else. "I don't expect forgiveness," he added quickly. I looked at him carefully then. Really looked. And for the first time in years I saw no performance left in him. Just an aging man finally confronting himself honestly. Something inside me loosened quietly. Not romantic love? That chapter had ended. But bitterness. The heavy bitterness I'd carried for so long. "I forgive you," I said softly. His eyes filled immediately. Not dramatic tears. Just grief. Relief. Humility. "Thank you," he whispered. I surprised myself by smiling faintly. "Forgiveness isn't permission, Ethan." "I know. It's just freedom." He nodded slowly like someone memorizing the sentence. A few minutes later, my father approached us. Even retired generals remain impossible to ignore in crowded rooms. Dad still carried authority naturally despite his age and stiffening knees. Ethan straightened immediately out of instinct. Dad studied him quietly for several seconds. Then he spoke. "A man is measured by what he does after failure." Simple words. But my father always preferred truth without decoration. Ethan nodded carefully. "I'm trying, sir." Dad's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "That matters." And just like that, the war between them quietly ended. Not through dramatic reconciliation. Through maturity. Through time. through acceptance that flawed people can still choose dignity afterward. Later that evening, Daniel drove me home through dark Virginia roads lined with glowing porch lights and autumn trees. "You okay?" he asked gently. I looked out the passenger window for a moment before answering. Yes. And I meant it. For the first time since my marriage collapsed, the story no longer felt unfinished. A week later, my parents invited everyone to the farmhouse for Sunday dinner. Not Ethan. Just family. My mother made roast chicken while my father complained about football rankings with the seriousness of international diplomacy. Daniel helped me wash dishes afterward while jazz music played softly through the kitchen. At one point, I glanced through the window toward the porch. My parents sat side by side beneath wool blankets watching the sunset over the fields. Their hands rested together naturally after nearly 50 years of marriage. No performance. No audience. Just loyalty weathered into tenderness over time. And suddenly I understood something that had taken me 60 years to fully learn. Real strength isn't loud. It isn't political influence or money or social status. It's the quiet courage to remain decent in a world constantly tempting people toward selfishness. It's choosing loyalty when nobody applauds for it. It's surviving disappointment without becoming bitter. It's allowing yourself to begin again after humiliation. Even late in life. Especially late in life. So, if you're listening to this story tonight, carrying heartbreak, regret, or disappointment of your own, I hope you remember something important. The people who appear quietest are often carrying the strongest foundations. And sometimes losing the life you expected becomes the first step toward finding peace you never thought possible. If this story touched you in some way, share it with someone who may need the reminder that dignity, kindness, and second chances still matter. And if you'd like more stories about resilience, family, and finding hope later in life, I'd be honored for you to stay a while longer.